She sold it for $1,000. Didn't look twice. Didn't ask questions. Just signed the paper, dropped the keys on the table, and turned away laughing with her assistant like the whole thing was a joke she'd already forgotten. A crumbling garage. A grease-stained mechanic. A check so small it wouldn't cover one night at the hotel she'd slept in the night before. Scarlett Vaughn thought she was getting rid of garbage. She had no idea she was handing a quiet, broken man the exact thing he needed to rebuild everything she never believed he deserved. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The cold that February morning wasn't the kind that politely announced itself. It came sideways off the Detroit River, cut through jacket collars, found the gaps between scarf and skin, and stayed there. The kind of cold that made your fingers go numb inside your gloves and made your coffee go lukewarm before you even reached the car. The kind that made sensible people stay inside. Mason Reed was not a sensible person, or at least that's what his friend Tyler had been telling him for the past 3 weeks. He was standing outside the Krause building on Vernor Highway at 7:42 in the morning, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his old Carhartt jacket. A jacket that had seen better days, better winters, better versions of him, staring up at a building that most people had stopped seeing years ago. The windows were boarded. The metal roll-up doors were locked with a padlock that looked like it had been there since the Carter administration. Graffiti ran across the lower brick in faded blues and reds, the tags of kids who had long since grown up and moved on. A gutter hung loose from the roofline on the left side, swinging slightly in the wind like it was tired of holding on. It was ugly. There was no getting around that. Mason pulled out his phone and looked at the listing again. Former automotive service garage. 4,800 square feet. Structural issues. Sold as is. The price was listed at $1,000, and even that felt like whoever typed it had made a typo and been too embarrassed to correct it. He put his phone back in his pocket and kept staring. There was something about the place. He couldn't explain it in words that would have satisfied anyone logical. Tyler had asked him twice why this particular building, why this particular wreck, and Mason hadn't been able to give him a straight answer. It just felt like something. And after the year he'd had, after the layoff, after the custody battle, after the months of scraping by on side jobs and favors, and too much pride to ask for help, feeling something about anything was more than he'd had in a long time. He heard the SUVs before he saw them. 2 black Cadillac Escalades pulled up to the curb with the kind of quiet confidence that expensive vehicles carry, and 4 people climbed out. 3 of them were assistants. Mason could tell by the way they moved, slightly too alert, slightly too eager, tablets and folders already in hand. The 4th was Scarlett Vaughn. He recognized her from the magazine cover he'd seen at the dentist's office 6 months ago. Detroit's youngest real estate titan. She'd been photographed on a rooftop somewhere downtown, arms crossed, skyline behind her, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Mason's car. In person, she was smaller than he'd expected, but everything else about her was exactly as advertised. Sharp, polished, moving like someone who had never once in her adult life been made to wait for anything. She was 30 years old, though she carried herself like someone who had skipped the years where you still made mistakes and felt bad about them. Her lead assistant, a woman named Priya, who wore glasses and spoke in rapid, efficient sentences, walked beside her holding a leather portfolio. Behind them, a man in a gray pea coat was already on his phone, presumably doing something important, and a younger guy with a laptop bag over his shoulder was struggling to keep pace on the icy sidewalk. Scarlett stopped a few feet away from Mason and looked at the building. Not the way Mason had been looking at it. Not with any particular curiosity. She looked at it the way you'd look at a dead plant you needed to throw out. Something to be dealt with and moved on from. Then she noticed Mason standing there. Her eyes moved over him once, fast, the way people scan something when they've already decided it isn't worth a second look. Old jacket, work boots that had been resoled at least twice, a face that was tired in a way sleep alone wouldn't fix. "Mr. Reed?" Priya said, stepping forward with a professional smile. "Yeah," Mason said. "That's me." Priya opened the portfolio and started talking. The address, the parcel number, the condition disclaimer, the ass's clause, the transfer of liability. Mason listened, nodded, watched Scarlett out of the corner of his eye. Scarlett had already turned away. She was talking quietly to the man in the gray pea coat, and Mason caught fragments of it. Push the demo permit through by end of month if we close today. Whole block is gone by summer if the council... Just get it off the books. It's not worth the carrying cost. Mason looked back at the building. Any questions about the terms? Priya asked him. No, he said. I've read everything. Priya glanced at Scarlett, got a small nod, and held out a pen. Mason signed. It happened fast. There was no ceremony to it, no handshake that meant anything, no moment that felt significant in the way the movies would have it. 1 minute he didn't own a building, and the next minute he did. Priya took his cashier's check, $1,000. Every cent of it, money he'd pulled from an account he'd been telling himself was for emergencies, and handed him 2 keys on a rusted ring. That was it. Scarlett was already walking back toward the first Escalade. Enjoy it, she said. And she said it without turning around, said it to the cold air between them, and there was something in her voice, not cruelty exactly, more like the casual amusement of someone who had already moved 3 thoughts ahead and found the whole situation mildly funny. Her assistant Priya at least had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable before turning and following. Mason stood on the sidewalk holding the keys. The Escalades pulled away. The wind came back off the river. He closed his fingers around the cold metal of the keys, felt the rust of them against his palm, and looked back up at the boarded windows of the building he now owned. He told his daughter Lily about it the night before, sitting across from her at the kitchen table while she was doing her homework. Lily was 8, and she had her mother's eyes, dark brown, wide, the kind of eyes that didn't miss things. She had been working on a math worksheet, pencil moving in careful, deliberate strokes, when Mason had sat down and said, I want to tell you about something I'm thinking about doing. Lily looked up. Is it the building? He blinked. How did you know about the building? Tyler told me. She went back to her worksheet. He said you were going to buy a broken garage for $1,000 and fix it up, and that it was either a great idea or a terrible one, and he wasn't sure which. Mason made a mental note to have a conversation with Tyler about what counted as adult business. What do you think? He asked. Lily was quiet for a moment, pencil still moving. I think you should do it, she said finally. Why? She looked up again with that look she got sometimes, the one that made him feel like she was the parent, and he was the one who needed reassurance. Because you've been sad for a long time, she said simply, and at least this way you'd have something to do. He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. Also, she added, looking back down at her math, Tyler said there might be old cars in there, and you like cars. The day after the signing, Mason was back at the garage at 5:15 in the morning. The sun wasn't up yet. The streetlights on Vernor were that particular shade of orange that made everything look like an old photograph, and the street was empty except for a city truck doing something with a pothole 2 blocks down. He'd borrowed a heavy-duty flashlight from Tyler and brought a crowbar, a box cutter, and a notebook. An actual paper notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that he'd bought at a drugstore for $2. He didn't know exactly what he expected to find, but he wanted to write it down when he did. The padlock on the main roll-up door was ancient, but the key worked after some jostling. The door itself was another matter. The rollers had seized up from years of disuse, and it took Mason 20 minutes of brute force and creative swearing before he got it up high enough to duck under. The smell hit him first. Oil. Old rubber. Dust so thick it had its own texture. And underneath all of that, something else, metal, cold metal, the particular scent of machines that had been sitting in the dark for a long time. He clicked on the flashlight and swept it across the interior. The space was bigger than it looked from the outside. 4 bays, maybe 5. A concrete floor cracked in places, stained dark with decades of oil. A metal workbench running the length of the back wall, covered in tools that had been left like someone walked out one afternoon and never came back. A stack of old tires in the corner, flat and cracked. Shelving units along the walls, loaded with cans and bottles and boxes whose labels had faded into illegibility. And in the middle of it all, the tarps. 7, 8, maybe 9 of them. Heavy canvas tarps, dark with dust, draped over shapes that filled most of the floor space. Some were smaller, car-sized. Some were larger. They were arranged in rows like sleeping animals, and they'd been there long enough that the dust on them had formed a kind of skin. Mason stood there for a moment, flashlight pointed at the nearest one. He'd had a hunch. That was the thing he could never quite explain to Tyler, or to himself, really. He'd seen the shape of things under those tarps from a gap in the boards on the side window when he'd come to look at the listing 3 weeks ago. Just a glimpse, a curve of metal, a spoke of a wheel. Enough to make him wonder. Enough to make him think the garage might not be entirely empty. He had not expected this. He walked to the nearest tarp and grabbed a corner of it. The canvas was stiff and heavy, and when he pulled it away, a cloud of dust rose up and sent him back 3 steps, coughing and waving his free hand in front of his face. When the air cleared, he pointed the flashlight at what was underneath. A 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1 sat in the first bay. The paint, what was left of it, was original fastback green, though it had gone dull and chalky under years of darkness. The chrome around the headlights was pitted but intact. All 4 tires were flat, sunk into the concrete under the weight of the car, but the body itself— Mason moved the light slowly across it. The body was solid. No catastrophic rust, no collision damage, just years of neglect, sitting still in the dark like it had been waiting. Mason put his hand on the hood. It was cold. Obviously cold, but there was something almost physical about touching it, like making contact with something that had been forgotten but hadn't yet given up. He opened his notebook and started writing. He pulled every tarp that morning. It took him almost 3 hours, working methodically from front to back, pulling each canvas away carefully and giving himself time to look before moving to the next. His notebook filled up fast. The Mustang. A 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS, dark blue under the grime, with a hood that had a small dent on the passenger side, but was otherwise remarkable. A 1967 Pontiac GTO with its original 400 cubic inch engine still under the hood. He had to use the flashlight just to see the engine block. But he knew what he was looking at. A 1965 Ford Galaxy. A 1971 Plymouth Barracuda, one window cracked but the rest of the glass intact. A 1968 Dodge Charger, the car that made his breath catch for a second because it was so complete, sitting there in the dark like a prop from a film. And then the last bay. He pulled the tarp from the final car and stood very still. A 1971 De Tomaso Pantera. He'd only seen one in person before, at a collector show in Ann Arbor 4 years ago. A restored one, gleaming and perfect on a rotating platform with a crowd around it. This one was not gleaming and perfect. The Italian racing red had oxidized to a dusty brick color. The rear wing had a crack in it. One of the side mirrors was missing, but the body lines were intact. The interior looked complete through the driver's window. And when Mason got down on one knee and shone the flashlight under the chassis, what he saw made him stay on the floor for a long moment, just looking. He finally got up and wrote in his notebook, Pantera, 351 Cleveland, unrestored original, find out production number. He closed the notebook and sat down on a stack of old tire rims in the corner of the last bay. The flashlight was pointed at the ceiling, throwing diffuse light across the space, and in that light, all 8 cars were visible as shapes under their tarps. Or the ones he'd replaced anyway, because he'd pulled the tarps back over the ones he'd already documented. Old habit, you cover things that need protecting. He sat there for a while. He thought about Lily eating cereal alone at the kitchen table, and the way she'd said you've been sad for a long time, the same way she'd say, it looks like rain, just a fact, delivered without drama, the way kids say true things before they learn to soften them for the adults in their lives. He thought about the engineering job he'd had for 6 years before the company restructured and eliminated his entire department with 2 weeks' notice and a severance package that had run out 4 months ago. He thought about the night he'd told Lily they were going to have to be careful with money for a while, and how she'd nodded and said okay, and then asked if they could still get hot chocolate on Saturdays because that was the thing she cared about. Not the furniture, not the apartment, just Saturday hot chocolate. He thought about sitting on a plastic chair in a courthouse hallway 18 months ago, in a suit he'd borrowed from Tyler because his own didn't fit right anymore, waiting to find out how much of his daughter's life he was going to be allowed to be a part of. He thought about all the things he'd lost, and all the things he'd almost lost, and all the things he was still trying not to lose. And then he looked at the shapes under the tarps, and he thought, okay. Mom. Tyler arrived at 8:30 with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man bracing to be disappointed. Tyler Marsh was 34, big-shouldered and easygoing, The kind of guy who made friends with strangers at gas stations and remembered the names of their dogs. He and Mason had met on a job site 8 years ago and had been friends ever since. The kind of friendship that didn't require a lot of maintenance because it was built on something solid. Tyler did general contracting work, mostly residential, and he was good at it in the practical, unglamorous way that people who actually do things well are good at them. He ducked under the roll-up door and stood up, looked around, and went quiet. "Mason," he said. "Yeah." "Are those—" "Yeah." Tyler walked slowly to the nearest tarp, the one Mason had pulled back over the Mustang, and lifted a corner of it. He looked at the car for a long moment. Then he let the tarp fall back and turned around. "How many?" he asked. 8. Tyler looked around the space again, counting shapes. "You knew?" "I thought maybe 2 or 3, Mason said. "I saw something through the window on my walk-through. I didn't know it was this." Tyler was quiet again. He handed Mason one of the coffees without looking at him, still processing the room. "The woman who sold this," Tyler said. "The Vaughn woman." "Yeah." "She didn't look?" "Apparently not." Tyler turned around slowly, taking in the whole space, the cars, the tools on the wall, the bones of the building itself. His contractor's eye moved differently than Mason's mechanic's eye, assessing structure rather than machinery. "Roof's got issues," he said. "You can see it in the far corner. See that staining on the concrete? Water's been coming in. Might be fixable. Might not." He walked toward the back wall. "Electrical is a disaster. None of this is up to code. You'd need a full rewire before you could even think about running equipment." He examined the workbench, tested the weight of the metal shelving. "Foundation looks okay, though, and the floor is solid." He turned around. "What's your actual plan here?" "Restore the cars," Mason said. "Start with the ones I can do alone. Sell them. Use the money to do the next ones. And if the first one takes 6 months and costs more than it sells for, it won't. But if it does, then I'll figure it out." Mason drank his coffee. "I know these cars, Tyler. I've known these cars my whole life. The Mustang alone, in the right condition, to the right buyer, we're talking 60, 70,000 minimum. That Pantera back there?" He nodded toward the last bay. "I need to find the production number and do some research, but if it's what I think it is, that car is worth more than everything else in this room combined." Tyler looked at the tarp over the last bay for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you believe me? Or okay, you'll help me?" Tyler looked at him. "I already said I'd help you. I said that 2 weeks ago. I just wanted to understand what we were walking into." He looked around the room one more time. "It's a lot of work." "I know." "The roof alone." "I know." "And you've got Lily 4 days a week, so the timeline is—" "Tyler." Mason looked at him. "I know. I know all of it. I know it's a lot of work, and I know the timeline is going to be hard, and I know there are 12 ways this could go wrong. I know." He paused. "But I also know that 6 months ago I was sitting in my car outside a Home Depot at 11 at night, trying to figure out if I could afford to take Lily to a movie on her birthday." He stopped. "I need to try something." Tyler was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the kind of nod that closes an argument without winning it. "Okay," he said. "Let's figure out the roof first." March came in cold and stayed that way. Mason established a rhythm that would have exhausted most people and simply became normal for him. When Lily was with him, Sunday through Wednesday, he would drop her at school at 8, work in the garage until 2:30, pick her up, make dinner, help with homework, get her to bed, and then sometimes go back to the garage for a few hours at night when he could manage it without falling asleep over the workbench. When she was with her mother Thursday through Saturday, he worked as many hours as his body would hold. Tyler came on weekends and some weekday evenings. He fixed the roof first, a 2-week job that turned into 4 because what looked like minor water damage turned out to be 3 layers of patched issues going back decades. Then he started on the electrical, pulling old wiring and running new circuits while Mason worked on the Mustang. The Mustang was the obvious starting point. Not the most valuable car in the room. That was the Pantera, without question, but the most knowable one. Mason had worked on Mustangs his entire adult life. He understood them the way some people understand languages they learned young, not through study, but through exposure, through hands and hours and accumulated instinct. He could hear what was wrong with a Mach 1 in the same way a musician can hear a note that's slightly off pitch. He started with a full disassembly of the drivetrain, documented everything in photographs and in the notebook, then began working through the components one by one. The 428 Cobra jet engine, which was what made this particular Mach 1 genuinely valuable, turned out to be in better condition than he'd hoped. Rings were worn, the carburetor needed rebuilding, a few seals had dried and cracked, but the block itself was solid. He'd rebuilt worse from worse starting points. The bodywork was where he spent the real time. He stripped the original paint down carefully, methodically, trying to preserve as much of the original material as possible because authenticity was what collectors paid for. He found some surface rust along the lower quarter panels that took 2 weeks to address properly. He replaced the weather seals, rebuilt the convertible linkage. The car had a manually operated rear window that most people didn't know how to work, and sourced original spec parts through a network of suppliers he'd been cultivating since his mid-20s. He didn't cut corners. That was a decision he made early and stuck to. It would have been faster and cheaper to use reproduction parts in places where the difference wasn't obvious. But Mason had a particular feeling about honest work. Not moral, not religious, just practical. He believed that things done right tended to last, and things done wrong tended to announce themselves at the worst possible moment. Lily came to the garage on the weekends when she was with him. She would sit on a folding chair with her homework or her book and watch him work, occasionally asking questions that were more perceptive than he expected. She had his engineer's brain, people said, a habit of looking at how things worked, of wanting to understand mechanisms. She learned the names of tools without being taught them, just from watching and listening. She learned how to hand him a wrench the right way, socket end toward him without being asked. One Saturday afternoon, in late March, she was sitting on the chair reading when she looked up and said, "Dad, why do people pay so much for old cars?" Mason was under the Mustang's chassis. "What do you mean?" "Like, this car is old and broken, but you said someone might pay $60,000 for it. Why?" He thought about it. "Because it connects them to something," he said. "When people were young, or something they remember. Or because it's rare and rare things have value. Or sometimes just because it's beautiful and it was made well and beauty is worth something." He paused. "All three, usually." Lily considered this. "Is it beautiful?" "It will be. It doesn't look beautiful right now." "No," he agreed. "Right now it looks like a project." She went back to her book. A few minutes later, without looking up, she said, "I think it'll be beautiful when you're done." By the end of March, Tyler had the electrical done and had started working on the structural reinforcement of the rear wall, which had some subsidence issues that needed addressing before Mason could safely run heavy equipment. The roof was patched and sealed. The lights were on. The space had begun to feel less like a ruin and more like a garage. Mason was deep in the Mustang restoration, engine rebuilt and back in the car, bodywork moving toward primer, when he got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. He was elbow deep in a fuel line issue, and the phone was on the workbench across the room. He wiped his hands and picked it up. "Is this Mason Reed?" A woman's voice, professional but not cold. "Yeah, who's this?" "My name is Karen Walsh. I got your number from a guy named Dennis Kowalski. He said you restored his '66 Chevelle last year." "I did." "Yeah." Mason leaned against the workbench. Dennis Kowalski was a retired auto plant manager from Dearborn, who Mason had done a side job for during the worst of the lean months. A partial restoration on a car Dennis had been keeping in his garage for 20 years and never had the time to work on himself. "He said you were the best he'd ever seen," Karen said. His words. "Dennis is generous. He's also particular, which is why I called you instead of one of the bigger shops." A brief pause. "I have a 1965 Shelby Mustang, GT350, original. My late husband bought it in 1972, and it's been in a climate-controlled storage unit for the last 11 years. Mason was very still. A 1965 Shelby GT350 original was not a side job. It was not a project. It was a serious collector vehicle worth, depending on condition and provenance, somewhere between $200,000 and $400,000. "What kind of work does it need?" he asked carefully. "Cosmetic mostly. Some mechanical. Dennis thinks it needs a full assessment first. Another pause. Could you come look at it? Yes, Mason said. I can do that. He told Tyler about it that evening while they were cleaning up. Tyler stopped sweeping and looked at him. She said, Shelby GT 350, 1965. Original. And she wants you to restore it. She wants me to look at it first. Tyler was quiet for a moment, leaning on the broom handle. Mason, that car, if it's what she says, I know what it is. That's a different conversation than selling the Mustang. That's a different category of business. He paused. You'd need a real shop for that. Insurance, liability. You can't do a car like that under... He gestured at the space around them. Under a repaired roof. I know, Mason said. So what are you going to do? Mason looked around the space. The Mustang and its bay, gleaming now in primer, almost ready for paint. The other cars still under their tarps, waiting. Tyler's electrical work clean and solid on the walls. The floor that he'd spent a weekend cleaning until it looked like a floor again instead of a decade of automotive sediment. I'm going to finish the Mustang, he said. I'm going to sell it. And then I'm going to have the conversation about the Shelby with what I get from it. He paused. One thing at a time. Tyler picked up the broom again. One thing at a time, he repeated in the tone of a man who had heard that phrase before and was reserving judgment on whether it was wisdom or denial. The Mustang was finished on the second Saturday of April. Mason had been awake until 2 a.m. the night before, finishing the final detail work. The chrome, the glass, the interior, which he'd had reupholstered by a woman in Hamtramck who'd been doing classic car interiors for 30 years, and who had looked at the original material and told him what dye formula she'd need to match it exactly. The paint was fastback green, mixed to the original factory specification, applied in 2 coats with a clear coat over the top that made the color look like it was lit from the inside. He drove it out of the bay at 9 a.m. just to hear it run in the open air. The 428 fired clean and loud and settled into a rumble that you felt in your sternum, the kind of engine note that made people stop walking and turn around. He let it idle for a moment, listening to it, then took it slowly around the block once with both windows down and the cold April air coming in. When he pulled back into the bay and turned it off, Tyler was standing there with his arms crossed and a look on his face that was trying very hard to be neutral and failing. Well, Tyler said. Yeah, Mason said. That's a car. That's a car, Mason agreed. He sat in the driver's seat for another moment, hands on the wheel, looking out through the windshield at the garage wall. Then he got out and walked around it once, slowly, looking at it the way he'd looked at it that first morning under the flashlight. Except now it was the opposite of that. Now it was the thing it had been before all those years of darkness, the thing it had been made to be. He took out his notebook and wrote, Finished, April 13th, start calls Monday. Karen Walsh came to the garage the following week to see the Mustang before Mason listed it anywhere. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and the no-nonsense manner of someone who had spent a career in a field that didn't reward sentiment. She walked around the Mustang 3 times without saying anything, then crouched down and looked at the undercarriage, then opened the hood and stood there looking at the engine. Dennis was right, she said finally. About what? About you being the best he'd ever seen. She closed the hood. I'll give you $95,000 for it. Mason blinked. He had been prepared to list it at 75, hoping for 80. 95 was a number that changed the math on everything else in the room. That's generous, he said carefully. Karen looked at him over the hood. It's not generous, she said flatly. It's fair value. The restoration is flawless, and the engine is correct, and everything is documented. I've bought enough of these to know what they're worth. A brief pause. Also, I want you to do the Shelby, so I have an interest in making sure you have operating capital. Mason looked at the car, then at Karen. Okay, he said. Okay, I accept? Okay, I accept. Karen nodded once, the way people do when they've been expecting a yes but are relieved to have it confirmed. I'll have my accountant contact you this week. She looked around the rest of the garage, at the shapes under the tarps, at Tyler's work on the walls, at the bones of the space. How long have you been here? About 2 months? And before this? Engineering. I got laid off. Karen looked at him for a moment with an expression that was hard to categorize. Not quite sympathy, not quite admiration, something more practical than either. What kind of engineering? Mechanical. I was doing design work for an automotive supplier. So you know what you're doing? I know what I'm doing, he said. She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd left it. I'll tell you something, she said, pulling it on. I've dealt with a lot of restoration shops over 30 years. Big operations, small operations, everything in between. She looked at the Mustang one more time. The good ones aren't the ones with the most equipment. They're the ones where the person doing the work actually gives a damn about the cars. She glanced at him. This car knows it was cared for. That sounds insane, but it's true. After she left, Mason sat on the tire rims in the corner of the last bay. He was sitting in almost exactly the same spot where he'd sat that first morning, flashlight pointed at the ceiling, 8 cars under their tarps. Now there were 7, and in his phone was a number, $95,000, that was going to become a wire transfer by the end of the week. He thought about calling Lily. She was at her mother's until Thursday, and it was only Tuesday. He picked up his phone and called her anyway. She answered on the 3rd ring, slightly breathless, the way kids answer when they've been in the middle of doing something. Dad? Hey, Bug. What's up? Are you okay? I'm okay. He paused. I sold the Mustang. A beat of silence. How much? He told her. There was a longer silence, and then, Dad, that's a lot of hot chocolates. He laughed. It came out loud and sudden and surprised him, and it was the best he'd felt in longer than he could easily remember. Yeah, he said. That's a lot of hot chocolates. Chats. That night he drove back past the garage on his way home. He hadn't intended to stop, but he slowed down when he passed it and pulled to the curb and sat there for a minute with the engine running. The building was dark inside, just the way he'd found it, but the roll-up door was fixed now. The broken gutter had been replaced. The boards were off the windows on the side, and if you walked up close, you could see inside. The work lights he'd left on a timer, the cars under their tarps, the workbench along the back wall with its tools hanging organized and deliberate. It didn't look like a ruin anymore. It looked like a place where something was happening. Mason sat there for another minute, not thinking about anything in particular, then pulled back onto Vernoor and drove home through the dark Detroit streets, the heater running, the radio off, the city moving quietly around him the way cities do at night. Indifferent, enormous, full of things going on in buildings that people drove past every day without looking. He got home, took off his boots at the door, and went to bed. He slept without dreaming, which was the first time in months he'd managed that. The wire transfer came through on a Thursday morning. Mason was under the Chevelle when his phone buzzed on the concrete floor beside him. He was on his back, checking the front suspension geometry, and he reached over without looking and picked it up the way you do when you're in the middle of something and you don't want to lose your place. He read the notification, put the phone back down, kept working for another 30 seconds, then stopped. He slid out from under the car and sat up on the cold floor and looked at his phone again. $95,000. His account. Confirmed. He sat there on the concrete for a long moment, grease on his forearms, a socket wrench in his hand, looking at the number on the screen the way you look at something you've been waiting for long enough that when it actually arrives, there's a half second where your brain doesn't quite accept it as real. Then Tyler came through the side door with 2 sandwiches in a paper bag and said, "Lunch," and stopped when he saw Mason's face. What happened? Money cleared. Tyler set the sandwiches down on the workbench. All of it? All of it. Tyler was quiet for a moment, and then he did something Mason hadn't expected. He sat down on the floor next to him. Just sat down, cross-legged on the concrete, right there in the middle of the bay, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He looked at the Chevelle in front of them. So what do we do now? Same thing we were doing, Mason said. Keep going. With what? Mason looked around the room. The Chevelle, the GTO, the Charger, the Barracuda, and in the last bay, still under its tarp, the Pantera. I want to do 2 more before I touch that one, he said, nodding toward the last bay. Build the business right first. Establish the reputation. By the time I pull that tarp off for real, I want people to already be talking about this place. Tyler picked up one of the sandwiches and handed the other to Mason. And the Shelby? Karen Walsh's car? I called her yesterday. I'm going to the storage unit next week to do the assessment. Mason unwrapped the sandwich without looking at it. That's a different kind of job. That's not a flip. That's a long-term restoration for a specific client, probably 6 months minimum. I need to figure out how to run both at the same time. You're going to need help, Tyler said. Not just me on weekends, actual help. Someone who knows engines the way you do. Mason bit into the sandwich. I know. Do you know anyone? He thought for a moment. Maybe, he said. There's a guy, Andre Simmons. He was at the supplier with me before the layoff. He got cut 6 weeks before I did. Phenomenal with drivetrain work. Last I heard he was doing oil changes at a Jiffy Lube off Michigan Avenue. Tyler looked at him. You haven't called him? I wasn't ready to hire anyone until now. You sure you're ready now? Mason looked at the room, the cars, the tools, the space that had gone from ruin to something else over the past 2 months of punishing, expensive, unglamorous work. No, he said honestly, but I'm going to call him anyway. He called Andre Simmons that evening, standing outside the garage in the fading April light with his hands in his jacket pockets. The phone rang 4 times, and Mason was already composing a voicemail in his head when Andre picked up. Yeah? Andre, it's Mason Reed. A beat of silence. Mason? A sound in the background, a TV maybe, or a radio. Man, it's been a minute. It has. How are you doing? I'm working, Andre said, which was not quite the same thing as answering the question, but Mason let it go. You? I'm working too. I bought a building down on Vernor, old garage. I've been restoring classics. He paused. I just sold a 69 Mach 1 for 95. Silence on the other end, then 95,000? Yeah, another silence. What kind of condition was it in when you got it? Rough. Hadn't moved in 30 years. You did it solo? Tyler Marsh helped with the structure and electrical. The mechanical and body was me. Andre was quiet again, and Mason could almost hear him thinking. What are you calling me for, Mason? I've got 7 more cars in the building, Mason said. I need someone who can do what you do. He paused. I can't pay you what the supplier was paying, not yet. But I can pay you, and I can tell you honestly that if the next 6 months go the way I think they're going to go, the conversation about money changes. 6 months is a long time on a maybe. I know it is. What kind of cars are we talking about? Chevelle SS GTO, Charger, Barracuda, Galaxy. A pause. And a De Tomaso Pantera. The silence this time was different. Longer. An original Pantera. 351, Cleveland, unrestored. I haven't even pulled the full tarp on it yet. I wanted to have the right person in the room when I did. Andre Simmons didn't say anything for almost 10 seconds. Then he said, What time do you open? 7. I'll be there at 7. He came at 6:45. Mason heard the truck in the parking lot before he had the roll-up door fully up. And when Andre walked in, he was exactly as Mason remembered him. Compact, precise moving, with the particular kind of quiet that belongs to people who are more interested in doing things than talking about them. He was 36, a couple of years older than Mason, and he had the kind of hands that told a story, scarred in the right places, the fingernails of someone who worked with metal, a faint tremor in the left one that Mason noticed but didn't mention. Andre stopped inside the door and stood there looking at the space the way Tyler had on that first morning, taking inventory, processing, going quiet with it. How long did this take, he said. 2 months to get the building workable. Another 2 on the Mustang. Andre walked to the Chevelle and ran his hand along the roofline, walked to the GTO, lifted the corner of the tarp on the Charger. He moved through the space slowly, methodically, and Mason let him do it without narrating, which was the right call because Andre was the kind of person who needed to reach his own conclusions. Finally, Andre walked to the last bay and stood in front of the tarp over the Pantera. This it? He said. That's it. Andre looked at Mason. Mason nodded. Andre reached out and grabbed the corner of the tarp and pulled it. The canvas came away differently than it had that first dark morning under the flashlight. Now there was actual light in the building. The overheads Tyler had installed, warm and strong, and what emerged from under the tarp looked different in light than it had in the beam of a flashlight. The oxidized red, the damaged wing, the missing mirror, the dust still caught in the body seams, all of it visible and detailed and specific. Andre crouched down and looked at the nose, then the side, then the rear. He got on his knees and looked under the chassis the way Mason had done. He stood up and looked through the driver's window at the interior. He went around the passenger side and checked the door gaps. He went back to the front and stood there with his arms crossed, looking at the car the way people look at something that requires a decision. "What's the production number?" he asked. "Still working on that. The VIN decodes to a mid-year 71 build. I've got a contact at the Pantera registry. I'm waiting on confirmation." "What's the story on it? How did it end up here?" Mason shook his head. "I don't know yet. The building changed hands 3 times between the 80s and when the Vaughn company acquired it. Whoever owned it last either forgot about the cars or just stopped caring." He paused. "I've tried to track down the history. It's murky." Andre stood looking at the car for another moment. "It needs a full mechanical overhaul," he said. "The cooling system on these was always the weak point. Ford 335 series in an Italian body not designed for it. If it sat 30 years without being run, the cooling system is probably a total rebuild. Brakes too. Clutch." He walked around to the engine cover and examined the lid. "You have the keys?" Mason produced the second key from the ring, a small flat key he'd identified as likely the ignition on his first walkthrough. Andre took it, looked at it, and carefully inserted it into the door lock. It turned. He opened the door and sat in the driver's seat, not starting it. Mason hadn't tried to start any of the cars. That wasn't the point yet. Just sitting in it, with his hands on the wheel, looking at the dash. "Original odometer," Andre said. 11,412 miles. Mason wrote it in the notebook. Andre got out and closed the door carefully. He covered the car back up. Then he looked at Mason. "When do I start?" "Monday," Mason said, "if you want it." "I want it." A pause. "What does the money look like?" Mason told him the number. It wasn't generous. It was honest. Andre looked at it the way people look at numbers that don't quite cover what they need but are better than the alternative. "Okay," Andre said. "Okay?" "I said okay, Mason. Let's not make it weird." He looked around the shop. "But I want it in writing, nothing against you, just how I operate." "That's how I operate too," Mason said. They shook hands. It was quick and businesslike, and both of them seemed relieved to have it done. The following Monday, Andre Simmons came to work at the garage on Werner Highway, and the shape of the operation changed. Where Mason had been working in the particular silence of a man alone with a project, now there were 2 people, 2 sets of hands, 2 perspectives on problems, and occasionally 2 opinions that did not immediately align. The first time they disagreed was about the GTO. Mason had planned to do the Chevelle next. It was in better cosmetic shape, and he figured it would move faster, generate revenue sooner. Andre looked at the GTO's engine on his second day and said the numbers didn't add up that way. "The Chevelle's going to need framework on the driver's side," Andre said, crouching beside it. "See here. There's been a repair at some point, welded over, but whoever did it didn't do it right. You're going to have to strip that out and do it properly, or it's going to show in the final assessment. That's 3-4 weeks minimum." He stood up. "The GTO's mechanically closer to done. If we split it, I take the GTO drivetrain, you do the body. We can have it ready for market in 6 weeks. Mason looked at both cars. He'd been looking at the Chevelle for 2 months and had the restoration mapped out in his head. Switching to the GTO meant rethinking the whole sequence. "The Chevelle's the better car," he said. "The Chevelle's the better car when it's done," Andre said. "The GTO is the better car to do next." He paused. "You asked me here because you needed someone to do this work. So let me do the work." Mason was quiet for a moment. "The GTO," he said. Andre nodded and went to get his tools. It was the right call, as it turned out, though Mason didn't say that to Andre, not then. The GTO's engine came apart cleanly, the 400 cubic inch block in better shape than expected, and Andre rebuilt it with the kind of focused, efficient precision that Mason recognized from their time at the supplier. Meanwhile, Mason worked the body, stripping, assessing, repairing the lower panels that had some rust damage, sourcing the original spec trim pieces that he needed to match the factory configuration. They worked mostly in a comfortable quiet, broken by occasional questions and occasional arguments that were always about the work and never about anything else. Andre brought his own lunch and ate it at the workbench while reading something on his phone. Mason usually forgot to eat until mid-afternoon and then ate whatever was close. They found a rhythm without discussing it, the way competent people tend to find rhythms when they respect each other's work. Karen Walsh's Shelby GT35O came into the shop in early May. Mason had driven out to the storage facility 2 weeks earlier for the assessment. A climate-controlled unit in Livonia paid up 2 years in advance, where Karen's late husband had parked the car in 2013 and where it had been sitting, presumably perfect, ever since. The car itself was everything the description had promised. An original, numbers-matching 1965 Shelby GT35O in Wimbledon white with blue racing stripes, 11,000 miles on the clock. The Paxton supercharger that had been optioned on a small percentage of 65 GT35Os still bolted in place under the hood. It was, without question, the most significant vehicle Mason had ever had professional responsibility for. He drove it back to the garage on a flatbed and backed it into the second bay, where it sat under its own cover, separate from the other cars, with a particular status that the other cars didn't have. This wasn't an anonymous treasure found under a dusty tarp. This was someone's dead husband's car, preserved across more than a decade out of love or grief or both, now entrusted to a man who had been running this operation for 3 months. Karen Walsh didn't hover. She came to the shop once, 2 days after delivery, walked around the car once and said, "Take care of it." Then she left. Mason took care of it. Andre looked at the Shelby the first morning it was in the shop, stood next to it for a long time, and finally said, "You know what this is worth?" "I know what it's worth. If something goes wrong, nothing is going to go wrong." Andre looked at him. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure about the car. I'm competent with the car." Mason looked at the Shelby. "I'm sure about myself when I'm working. That's all anybody gets." Andre considered that. "Fair enough," he said, and went back to the GTO. The days got longer as May deepened. Detroit shifted from the gray, ice-bitten mood of early spring into something warmer and more alive. And the neighborhood around the garage on Vernoor Highway shifted with it. People were outside more. The taqueria 2 doors down started putting tables on the sidewalk. The barbershop across the street had music coming out of it on weekend mornings. Mason started leaving the side door of the garage open during the day, and occasionally people would slow down on the sidewalk and look in, attracted by the sound of engines and the smell of paint, and the general sense that something interesting was happening in there. One afternoon, a teenager stopped at the open door and stood there for a long time without coming in. Mason was doing bodywork on the GTO and didn't notice him at first, and then he did, and he looked up. The kid was maybe 16, skinny, in a hoodie that was too big for him, staring at the GTO with an expression that was trying hard to look like nothing. "You can come in," Mason said. The kid looked startled, like he'd thought he was invisible. "I'm just looking." "I know. You can come in and look if you want." The kid came in slowly, stopping a few feet inside the door, looking around the space the way people look at things they want but have been told are not for them. "That's a GTO?" he said, nodding at the car. 1967, Mason said. Tri-Power 400. The kid looked at the engine, which was out of the car and on a stand, because Andre had finished the rebuild and Mason needed to do a detailed surface clean before reinstallation. "What's Tri-Power?" 3 2-barrel carburetors instead of 1 4-barrel. Pontiac did it in the mid-60s for performance. More carbs, more fuel-air mix, more power. The kid nodded. He was looking at the engine with the same expression Mason had seen on Lily's face sometimes. That particular combination of genuine interest and careful effort not to seem too interested. "You work on these every day?" "Every day." "You make money doing this?" Mason looked at him. Yes. The kid absorbed this. He looked around the shop, at the other cars, at the tools, at the Shelby under its cover in the second bay, at the wall where Tyler had mounted a board with photos of the finished Mustang, the in-progress work, the before and after documentation. "How'd you learn?" the kid said. "My uncle had a shop when I was young. I started hanging around when I was about your age." Mason paused, looking at the kid. "You in school?" "Yeah." "You taking any technical classes?" The kid looked slightly defensive. Why? Because if you're interested in this kind of work, there are programs, Mason said. He wasn't lecturing, just saying it the way you'd say the weather was good. Macomb Community College has a classic vehicle restoration program. I know someone there. He went back to what he was doing. I'm not telling you what to do, just that the path isn't as long as it looks from the outside. The kid stood there for another minute, then said, "Thanks," and left. Mason watched him go and then went back to the GTO. Andre came in from his lunch break about 20 minutes later and said, "Who was that? Neighborhood kid? You recruiting?" "No, just talking." Mason picked up a polishing cloth. "He reminded me of something." Andre looked at him. "What?" "Nothing specific," Mason said. "Just something." The GTO was finished on a Friday in late May. It came out dark blue with silver rally stripes, the 400 rebuilt and correct, the interior restored in original black vinyl, and it ran with the particular confident power of a muscle car that had been done properly. Not overstated, not modified beyond its original spec, just exactly what it was supposed to be. Mason drove it twice around the block, same as he had with the Mustang, same half-open windows and engine noise and the city moving past. And when he came back, Andre was waiting in the parking lot with his arms crossed. "Well?" Andre said. "It's right," Mason said. "I know it's right. How does it feel?" Mason thought about it. "Like something that was dead is alive," he said. Andre made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something less identifiable. "Yeah," he said, "that's the thing about these cars." The GTO went to a collector in Birmingham, Michigan, for $88,000. Slightly less than the Mustang, which was expected, but still a number that hit the account like a physical thing, something you could feel. Mason transferred a portion of it to the business account he'd opened the previous month, paid Andre's back wages and the month ahead, paid Tyler for materials and labor on the ongoing structural work, and put the rest against the equipment he'd been planning to buy. A proper frame machine, a better welding setup, a paint booth that wasn't the makeshift arrangement he'd been using. And that was fine for most things, but wasn't going to be good enough for the Pantera when the time came. He also, on an impulse he didn't entirely understand, put $5,000 into a separate account and labeled it in his notebook, Lily, College. It was an absurd thing to do. She was 8, but he did it anyway. Somewhere in the middle of May, Mason had gotten a call from a journalist named Patrick Osei, who wrote for a regional business magazine called Great Lakes Quarterly. Osei was working on a piece about non-traditional entrepreneurship in the Detroit area, businesses that had started from almost nothing and grown in unexpected ways. And someone had mentioned Mason's operation as a possible subject. Mason had almost said no. His instinct was to stay quiet, stay under the radar, finish the work before talking about the work. But Tyler, who happened to be at the shop when the call came, and who overheard the conversation, spent 10 minutes afterward making the case that visibility was not the enemy of a small business. It was oxygen. "You're doing something real," Tyler said. "Real things should be seen." "I'm not ready to be a story," Mason said. "You're already a story. The question is whether you're going to be a story that people find out about or a story that gets told about you." Mason thought about this for longer than he wanted to admit, and then he called Patrick Osei back and said yes. Osei came to the shop on a Tuesday morning in early June with a notebook and a photographer named Sandra, who moved quietly and shot things from angles Mason wouldn't have thought of. Osei asked good questions, not the obvious ones about how much the cars were worth or what his business revenue was, but the harder ones, the ones about how he'd found the garage and what he'd seen in it, and why he'd spent everything he had on a building that most people had driven past for years without looking twice. Mason answered as honestly as he could, which was not always comfortably honest. When Osei asked him about the period after the layoff, Mason said, "It was bad. I'm not going to make it sound like it wasn't. I had a daughter to take care of and no income, and I was trying to figure out what I was worth outside of a job title." He paused. "That's not a comfortable place to be." Osei wrote that down. "And the garage changed that?" "The garage gave me something to work on," Mason said. "The rest of it, I'm still working on it." It was an honest answer, and he wasn't entirely sure he should have said it, but there it was. Andre had made himself scarce during the interview, which Mason appreciated. Not because he didn't want Andre in the story, but because Andre would have been awkward about it. And awkward people make interviewers nervous. Instead, Sandra got photographs of the space and the cars and Mason working, and when she showed him one on the back of her camera, him bent over the Barracuda, which he'd started after the GTO, light falling across the car, and the tools, and his hands, he looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. "That's good," he said finally. Sandra looked at the image. "The light in here is good," she said. "Old buildings always have better light than new ones." "I'll tell the building you said that," Mason said, and Sandra smiled. The magazine piece was scheduled for the September issue, which was still months away. Mason put it out of his mind and went back to work. June arrived and brought the heat with it. The particular thick heat of a Detroit summer that sat in metal buildings and made mechanics sweat through shirts before 10 in the morning. Tyler installed 2 industrial fans in the rear of the shop that helped, mostly. Mason and Andre adjusted their hours, starting earlier to get the heavy work done in the cooler morning, and they found that this suited them both. The Barracuda moved faster than Mason had expected. It was a simpler car in some ways, fewer complicated systems, a more straightforward restoration path, and with Andre handling the drivetrain while Mason did body and paint, they had it done in 5 weeks. Plymouth B5 Blue, 440 cubic inch, a car that looked almost aggressive at rest, like it was holding something back. Mason drove it once around the block, same as always, and this time Lily was there to see it because it was a Saturday, and she'd come to the shop with him that morning. She was sitting on the folding chair outside when he pulled out, and she watched the car come out of the bay and into the parking lot, and her eyes went wide. "Dad," she said. "That's so cool." "Yeah?" "It looks angry." Mason looked at the car. "It kind of does," he agreed, "like it's annoyed about something." "Maybe it is," he said. 30 years under a tarp would annoy me too." Lily laughed at that. A real laugh, full and easy. The laugh of a kid who isn't performing happiness but actually feeling it. And Mason held on to that sound the way he held on to the memory of the first night he'd slept well in months. Small things. The kind of small things that, when you added them up, made a life. The Barracuda sold at a private collector sale in Ann Arbor for $72,000, which was slightly below what Mason had hoped, but exactly what the market was willing to pay for that configuration and year. He put it in the ledger, paid the bills, looked at the numbers, and let himself sit with the math for a few minutes. 3 cars sold, $255,000 gross. Expenses had been significant. Andre's wages, materials, Tyler's ongoing work on the building, the new equipment, but the net was holding, more than holding. The business was real. The business was working. He hadn't told anyone that. He'd kept it to himself the way you keep things when you're still not sure they're real, still half expecting the ground to shift and the numbers to change. That evening, after Andre had left and the shop was quiet, Mason pulled the cover off the Pantera. He didn't do it for any practical reason. The Pantera wasn't next. The Charger was next, and then the Galaxy, and then the Pantera, if the timeline held. He pulled the cover off because he needed to look at it. Because it had been sitting there for all these months, the last thing in the room, the thing he was working toward, and sometimes you needed to remind yourself of the destination. He stood in front of the car in the quiet shop, shop lights humming overhead, the evening light coming in gold through the side windows, the oxidized red, the cracked wing, the body lines that, even under years of neglect, carried the specific elegance of Italian design work, the way the rear flank swept out over the wheels, the way the windshield raked low, the aggressive forward posture of the nose. He thought about what it was going to take. The full mechanical overhaul Andre had outlined. The bodywork, more intensive than the other cars because Italian panel work from that era was unforgiving and any mistake would show. The paint, the restoration of the interior, which was going to require sourcing materials that hadn't been manufactured in decades. He also thought about the money, what the car would be worth, done correctly, to the right buyer. He'd done enough research by now to have a number in his head, and the number was significant enough that he wrote it down once in the notebook and then crossed it out because writing it felt like tempting something. He put the cover back on carefully, smoothing the edges down the way you'd tuck something in. He turned off the shop lights, locked the roll-up door, and stood outside in the warm June evening for a minute before getting in his truck. The city was doing what cities do in summer evenings. People on stoops, music from somewhere up the block, the smell of food from the taqueria 2 doors down. A world that had been going on all winter while he was inside working, indifferent and alive and ordinary. He'd been in such a tunnel for so long, head down, hands moving, one task then the next, that he sometimes forgot there was a world outside the shop. Sometimes forgot that other people existed in different ways, were dealing with things he knew nothing about, were watching things from angles he couldn't see. He thought about Scarlett Vaughn. He hadn't thought about her in weeks, which surprised him when he realized it. In the beginning, in those cold February nights when the roof was leaking and the electrical was a disaster and he was eating crackers and peanut butter over the workbench at midnight, he had thought about her occasionally, not with anger exactly, but with the particular edge that comes from having been underestimated by someone who had no reason to think twice about doing it. The way she'd turned away before the ink was dry, the comment she'd made to the cold air behind her. Enjoy it. He'd used it in the way you use small humiliations, turned it into something that kept him at the workbench when he should have gone home to sleep. But somewhere in the months of actual work, real work, hard work, the kind that requires all of you and doesn't leave much room for resentment, the edge had worn down. Not gone, just worn. The way sharp things do when you're too busy to sharpen them. He thought, she made a mistake. Not a malicious one, not even an interesting one particularly, just the ordinary mistake of looking at something and seeing only what she expected to see, and walking away before she'd actually looked. He thought, that's not unusual. He thought, I've probably done that too. He got in his truck and drove home. Lily had left a drawing on the kitchen table. She did this sometimes when she'd been at the house. Left something small, like a note she didn't need to write but wanted to. This one was a drawing in colored pencil. A garage with its roll-up door open, a car in the bay, and a stick figure with curly brown hair standing next to it. Under the car was a tiny stick figure that he could only identify as himself by the wrench in its hand. He stood at the table for a moment looking at it. He picked it up and put it on the refrigerator with a magnet. Then he made himself a cup of tea, something he'd started doing in the evenings instead of the second or third cup of coffee that used to keep him up too late, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened his notebook to the next blank page. He wrote the date at the top. Under it, he wrote the names of the remaining cars in order: Charger, Galaxy, Pantera. Under that, he wrote a number. The number he'd crossed out before, the number he couldn't quite bring himself to write where he might look at it and get superstitious. He wrote it here, in the privacy of the kitchen with no one watching, and looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed the notebook, finished his tea, and went to bed. He didn't sleep immediately. He lay in the dark and listened to the neighborhood. Traffic sounds, something happening 2 houses down, the ordinary nighttime voice of a city that never fully went quiet. He thought about the garage, the cars, Andre's rebuilt GTO engine and the particular sound it made on the first start. The way Lily said it looks angry about the Barracuda and laughed. He thought about the Pantera under its cover. He fell asleep somewhere in the middle of thinking about it, which was usually how it happened. Not a decision to sleep, but a gradual surrender to it, the body finally winning the argument the mind had been refusing to concede. Outside, Detroit did what it had been doing for 100 and some odd years. Kept going, kept changing, kept carrying in its bones all the things that had been built there and broken there, and sometimes, in certain places, in certain buildings, on certain streets, quietly put back together by people who knew how to look at damage and see what was underneath it. The Charger took 8 weeks. Not because it was the most technically demanding car in the shop. That was still the Pantera, waiting in the last bay with the particular patience of something that knew its turn was coming. The Charger took 8 weeks because Mason refused to rush it, and because there were 2 weeks in July where everything that could go wrong with the building went wrong at the same time. And because somewhere in the middle of all of it, Mason made a decision that changed the shape of what he was building in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. The building problems started on a Tuesday morning when Mason arrived at 6:30 to find 2 inches of water standing on the floor of the back bay. Not from the roof this time. Tyler had fixed the roof properly, and it had held through a week of hard rain without complaint. This was a drain. An old floor drain in the rear of the building that had been backing up quietly for weeks, finally losing the argument with whatever blockage had been accumulating in it since approximately the Reagan administration. The water smelled like 40 years of automotive history, which was not a pleasant smell. and it had reached the feet of 2 of the remaining covered cars before Mason got there. He called Tyler before 7. "How bad?" Tyler said, still audibly half asleep. "The drain backed up, 2 inches in the back bay." A pause. "Did it reach the cars?" "The covers got wet at the bottom. I don't think it got to the paint." "Don't move the cars until you check underneath the covers." "I know that, Tyler." "I'm just saying." "I know. How soon can you get here?" Tyler was there by 8. Andre came in at his usual time, and the 3 of them spent the morning pulling the water with a shop vac and then a pump Tyler had in his truck, checking the cars. No damage to the paint, the covers had done their job, and then assessing the drain situation, which turned out to involve a plumber, and 3 days of work and a bill that Mason paid without showing anyone his face when he looked at the number. While the plumber was working, they couldn't use the back half of the shop, which meant Mason and Andre were working in reduced space, which meant the charger's timeline slipped. Mason adjusted the schedule in his notebook, redrew the lines, and didn't say anything about it except to Karen Walsh, who called that week to check on the Shelby. "There's no issue with the Shelby," Mason told her. "We had a plumbing situation in the rear of the building. I kept it away from the Shelby, and the Shelby is fine. I'm just updating you because I told you I'd tell you if anything happened." Karen was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," she said. "Some shops would have just not mentioned it." "I'm not some shops," Mason said. "No," she said. "You're not." A brief pause. "How's the work going on it?" "Carefully," he said, which was the most accurate word he had. The Shelby work was the thing that was keeping him up at night, not because it was going badly, but because it was going in the way that high-stakes work always goes, which is slowly and with complete attention and with the constant awareness of how much was riding on each decision. The car was as good as Karen had said, original, numbers matching. The Paxton supercharger intact and functional in ways that most 30-year-old forced induction setups were not. But good original cars were also unforgiving in a specific way. Every choice you made in the restoration either honored the car or compromised it, and there was rarely a middle ground. Mason was sourcing original spec parts through 3 different suppliers and 2 private collectors who had parted out GT350s over the years. He was talking to a leather specialist in Tennessee about the interior, which needed work but needed to look like it hadn't been worked on. The hardest kind of restoration, the invisible kind. He was documenting everything in the notebook and in a separate digital file that he'd started keeping for the Shelby specifically, because Karen Walsh deserved paperwork that matched the quality of the work. He didn't talk about it much at the shop. Andre knew the status because Andre was in the shop. But even with Andre, Mason kept the Shelby conversation spare. Some projects needed space to breathe. The Charger came out at the end of July. It was black. Not a flashy black. Not a show car black with candy coat and gold flakes and all the theatrical excess that some restorers went in for. A correct, period-accurate black, the kind that made the car look like it was absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The 440 Magnum engine, which Andre had spent 2 weeks on, and which was the single most involved mechanical rebuild they'd done on any of the shop cars to date, ran with a voice that was different from the GTO and different from the Mustang and different from the Barracuda. Deeper, more deliberate. Mason drove it around the block and came back and sat in the parking lot with the engine running for a minute before he turned it off. Andre was standing outside. "You look like you're having a moment," he said. "I might be having a moment," Mason admitted. "That's allowed." Andre looked at the car. "That engine is right. I want you to know that. That's as right as I know how to make it." Mason looked at him. Andre didn't say things like that. Not compliments to himself, not announcements of his own quality of work. He said it the way someone says a fact they want on the record. "I know it is," Mason said. "I could hear it." The Charger went to a buyer in Chicago for $104,000. It was the first car Mason had sold for over $100,000. He looked at the number in the account, and then he looked at it again. Then he transferred Andre's share of the bonus he'd promised, a structure they'd agreed on in writing, a percentage of any sale over $90,000. And he sent Tyler the final payment on the structural work, which Tyler had been carrying at a discount for months and had never once mentioned. Tyler called him that evening. "You didn't have to send the full amount," he said. We agreed on a number." "I know we agreed on a number. I'm saying I wasn't going to hold you to it." Tyler, Mason said, I'm going to hold me to it. A pause. You fixed my roof in February in 20-degree weather, and you didn't take a check for 3 months. That number is what the number is. A long silence. Then Tyler said, You're the most stubborn person I've ever been friends with. And I was friends with Danny Kowalczyk for 12 years, so you understand the significance of that statement. I'll take it, Mason said. He also, that same week, finally made the call he'd been putting off about the real estate. It had started as a half-formed thought back in March. When he'd been looking at the city planning documents Tyler had pulled up on his laptop one evening while they were waiting for the plumber's epoxy to cure. Tyler had found a reference to a proposed infrastructure project, a transit expansion, the kind of large-scale city investment that took years to go from proposal to reality, but that, when it did, tended to change the value of every piece of land within half a mile of the corridor. The corridor in question ran directly through the neighborhood where the garage was located. Mason had looked at the documents and said nothing, but he'd started paying attention after that. He'd started walking the streets around the garage differently, not just as someone going to and from work, but as someone reading the terrain. He'd started looking at which buildings were vacant and which were occupied by businesses with month-to-month leases versus long-term ones. He'd started looking at who owned what, using the county property records that were public and available to anyone who knew where to look. He'd identified 4 properties within a 2-block radius that were priced below their likely future value if the transit project moved forward. He'd also talked, very carefully and quietly, to a real estate attorney named Patricia Cho, whom he'd found through Karen Walsh's recommendation, and Patricia had walked him through what it would take to acquire them without triggering the kind of market attention that came when a single buyer started picking up parcels in a concentrated area. He hadn't done anything yet. He'd waited, the way he'd waited before buying the garage, until he was sure. Now he called Patricia. I want to move on the Fenwick Street property, he said, the one we talked about in May. The warehouse? Yeah. The asking price is still... I know the asking price. I want to offer 12% under, see if they move. A pause on Patricia's end. Mason, that's a bold opening. The building has been sitting empty for 14 months and the owner is paying carrying costs on it. He'll move. Patricia was quiet for a moment in the way she got quiet when she was running numbers. Okay, she said finally. I'll reach out this week. Don't rush it, Mason said. Patient money. Where did you learn that phrase? Karen Walsh, he said. Patricia laughed. That sounds like Karen. He didn't tell anyone about the real estate. Not Andre, not Tyler, not Lily. Some decisions you needed to make alone, not because other people's input wasn't valuable, but because the decision was still taking shape and premature conversation could knock it off its axis. He'd learned that about himself over the years, that he needed to hold certain things quietly until they were solid enough to be held by more than one pair of hands. The September issue of Great Lakes Quarterly came out on a Thursday. Mason found out about it the way he found out about most things that happened in the world outside the shop. Late, and by accident, when Tyler texted him a link at 8 in the morning with no message attached, just the link. Mason was already at work, under the Galaxy, which he'd started the previous week and which had a frame alignment issue he was working through. He came out from under the car, opened the link, and read the article standing at the workbench with grease on his forearms. The piece was titled The Man Who Looked Inside. Patrick Ossie had written it well, better than Mason had expected, if he was being honest, because his expectation had been something that felt like a press release with quotes inserted. This felt like actual writing. It was about the garage and the cars, yes, but it was also about something harder to explain, the nature of seeing things, of looking past surface conditions, of the particular stubbornness required to act on what you see when everyone else has already walked away. Ossie had quoted Mason accurately, including the uncomfortable parts. The line about figuring out what he was worth outside of a job title was there, and Mason read it twice and thought about whether he wished it wasn't, and decided no. Sandra's photographs were on the page, the one she'd shown him on the back of her camera. Him bent over the Barracuda, light falling across his hands and the car, was there, and it looked different on the page than it had on a 3-inch screen. It looked like something worth looking at. He put his phone down and went back under the Galaxy. Andre came in at his usual time and didn't say anything about the article for the first 2 hours, which was very Andre. Then, Mid-morning, while Mason was doing something with the Galaxy's exhaust system and Andre was prepping materials for the Shelby interior, he said without looking up, "The article's good." "You read it?" Mason said from under the car. "Yeah." "When?" "This morning. My cousin sent me the link at 7. Mason came out from under the car and sat up. "What did you think?" Andre was quiet for a moment, looking at what he was doing. "I think it says true things about you," he said, "and I think it's going to bring people to the door." "Is that good or bad?" "Both," Andre said. "Probably more good than bad." He looked up. "You ready for that?" Mason thought about it honestly. "No," he said, "but I'm not going to not be ready by sitting here." Andre nodded and went back to work. Andre's prediction proved accurate faster than either of them expected. By Friday, 2 days after the magazine hit, Mason had received 11 emails through the shop's website, which Tyler had built 3 months ago and which Mason had mostly ignored. He read them Friday evening at the kitchen table, Lily doing her homework across from him. 3 were from collectors asking about availability of finished cars. 2 were from people with cars they wanted restored, including one man who had a 1969 Camaro Z28 that he'd been trying to find the right shop for. 2 were from journalists, one of whom was at a national publication that Mason recognized. One was from a law school professor in Ann Arbor who collected vintage racing cars and who had a car he was evasive about describing in the email, which Mason found interesting. One was from someone in California who said he'd read the piece and was interested in investing, which Mason deleted without responding. And one was from a woman who said she'd seen the photograph of the Barracuda and wanted to know if it was still available and how much. Mason wrote back to the ones he could write back to that night and forwarded the rest to a folder he labeled Follow-Up, which was the business equivalent of a pile on a corner of a desk, a place where things went to be dealt with later that you were not quite dealing with now. He wrote back to the woman asking about the Barracuda first, because her email was the simplest. "The Barracuda has sold. I'm currently finishing a 1965 Ford Galaxy and have a 1971 De Tomaso Pantera in early stages. If either of these interests you, I'm happy to talk." He wrote back to the man with the Camaro Z28 second, because the Camaro was the kind of job he wanted. "Tell me more about the car. Year, original configuration, current condition, and what you're looking for in a restoration. I'll let you know if I can take it on and what the timeline looks like." The others he left for the next day. Lily looked up from her homework. "What are you doing?" "Emails, business stuff." She looked at the screen. "How many?" 11. From the article. She went back to her homework. Then, after a minute, "Is that a lot?" "For a shop that didn't have a website until April? Yeah," he said. "That's a lot. Are you happy about it?" He thought about the honest answer. "I'm cautious about it," he said. "Happy and cautious." Lily considered this. "That's a grown-up way to feel about something good." "I guess it is," he said. "I'd just be happy," she said. "I know," he said. "That's one of the good things about being 8. She made a small sound that suggested she was taking that comment under advisement and went back to her homework. By the following week, the emails had grown to 31. Mason answered everyone personally, which took more time than he had, but which felt necessary because the alternative, a form response, a template, the impersonal machinery of a business trying to manage volume, felt like a betrayal of something he couldn't quite name. These were people who had read a piece about a man who paid attention to things. Responding to them with something that proved he didn't pay attention felt like the wrong lesson. One response in particular stopped him. It came from a man named Gerald Fitch, who introduced himself as a collector with 40 years of experience and a collection of 12 cars that he kept at a property outside of Ann Arbor. He'd read the article. He'd done some research on the Mustang sale. Word traveled in collector circles, and Karen Walsh apparently knew Gerald Fitch, which was how he'd connected the car to the shop. He had a question that wasn't about restoration. "I'm not writing about a specific car," Fitch wrote. "I'm writing because I have an interest in understanding what kind of operation you're building. I'm 67 years old, and I've seen a lot of restoration shops open and close in this city over the decades, and a small number of them have become something worth paying attention to. I think you might be building one of those. If you're willing, I'd like to meet." Mason read the email twice. Then he forwarded it to Karen Walsh with a single line. "Do you know a Gerald Fitch?" Karen's response came back within 20 minutes. I know Gerald very well. Meet with him. Don't be nervous. He met Gerald Fitch at a diner in Dearborn on a Wednesday morning. Fitch was a tall man in his late 60s, white-haired, with the deliberate movements of someone who had stopped being in a hurry decades ago and found the change agreeable. He was already there when Mason arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee and a folded newspaper, and he stood to shake hands with the kind of firmness that had nothing to prove. Sit down, Fitch said. The coffee here is terrible, but it's honest. Mason sat down. The waitress came and he ordered coffee, and then they were looking at each other across the table with the particular sizing up quality of two people who had both agreed to be here but weren't yet sure of the terms. Karen speaks well of you, Fitch said. She's been good to the business, Mason said. She's particular, Fitch said. Karen doesn't spend money on things she doesn't believe in. He looked at his coffee cup. I saw the photograph in the magazine. The Barracuda. Before that, I'd heard about the Mustang through the collector network. You sold it to Karen for $95 and she thought it was fair value. She told me it was fair value. Karen doesn't overpay out of politeness, Fitch said. If she said it was fair, it was fair. He paused. The Charger went to Chicago for $104. Mason looked at him. How do you know that? Fitch smiled, which was the first time his expression had shifted since Mason sat down. Because the man who bought it called me to ask if he'd made a good purchase, and I told him yes. The coffee came. Mason wrapped his hands around the mug and waited, because Fitch was clearly the kind of man who moved through conversations at his own speed. What I want to understand, Fitch said, is what you're actually trying to build. Not the story from the magazine, the real thing. What's the plan in 5 years? It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. Mason thought for a moment, not performing thought, but actually thinking, because he hadn't been asked this question out loud before. And the answer in his head was more formed than he'd realized until he started trying to put it into words. A real shop, he said, not a flip operation, not a place that churns out restored cars for quick margin. A place with a reputation for doing it right, long-term client relationships, the kind of work that gets referrals because the people who know cars talk to each other. He paused. And I'm looking at real estate in the area. The neighborhood has value that isn't being recognized yet. I want to own the building I'm in before that changes. Fitch was quiet, looking at him. You know about the transit project. I know about the proposal. I've been watching it. It's not a proposal anymore, Fitch said. The council approved final funding in August. It wasn't announced publicly because of some bond financing paperwork, but it's done. He looked at Mason steadily. The construction starts in 18 months. Mason absorbed this. 18 months was fast, faster than he'd expected. How do you know that? He asked. I've been in this city for 40 years, Fitch said simply. I know people. There was a silence between them. The diner was doing what diners did at mid-morning. Coffee cups being refilled, the sound of the kitchen, a table of older men near the window talking about something that had apparently been decided wrong by someone they all agreed was wrong. What are you interested in? Mason said. Specifically, Fitch looked at him. I have cars, he said. 12 of them. 4 of them need work that I haven't found the right shop for. I've been using a place in Bloomfield Hills for years, but the man who ran it retired in June, and the shop his son took over is not the same shop. He paused. I also occasionally hear about interesting vehicles before they reach the open market. I have no interest in acquiring more cars. I'm 67 and I have 12 of them, which is enough. But I sometimes know things that might be useful to someone building what you're building. Mason was quiet for a moment. What would that arrangement look like? You do honest work on my cars at a fair price, Fitch said, and I tell you things when I hear them. He paused. I'm not proposing a financial arrangement. I'm proposing a relationship. Those work differently. Mason looked at the man across the table, at the particular ease of someone who'd spent 40 years learning what he was worth and had stopped feeling the need to perform it. Okay, Mason said. Okay, I can do that, Mason said. Fitch picked up his coffee cup. Good. He drank from it, made a face that confirmed it was as bad as advertised, and set it down. Tell me about the Pantera. For the next 40 minutes, Mason talked about the Pantera, about finding it under the tarp, about the condition assessment, about the production number research that had finally come back from the registry, confirming it as one of a small number of original, unrestored examples known to exist in the United States. About the mechanical challenges and the bodywork and the sourcing complications. About the decisions he hadn't made yet and the ones he had. Fitch listened without interrupting, which was the mark of someone who was genuinely interested and not waiting for their turn to talk. When Mason finished, Fitch said, "Do you know what you're going to ask for it?" "I have a number in mind," Mason said. "I keep crossing it out and writing it again." "That means the number is right," Fitch said. "That's always how it works with the significant ones." He paused. "Have you thought about how you're going to sell it? Not to whom? How? Through what venue?" "I've been thinking about an auction," Mason said. "A collector auction. There's one in—" "I know which one you're thinking about," Fitch said. "The November event. I've consigned cars there before." He was quiet for a moment. "A Pantera like the one you're describing, at the right auction, with the right documentation and the right presentation. The number you've been crossing out and rewriting is probably low." Mason looked at him. "You haven't seen the car." "No," Fitch said. "But I know the market, and I know what an original unrestored example of that car means to the people who care about such things." He looked at Mason steadily. "Trust the car." When Mason left the diner and walked to his truck, he sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. The morning had the particular quality of a morning that had gone differently than expected. Not better or worse, just different, the kind of conversation that shifted the landscape slightly without being dramatic about it. He called Andre. "How's the Galaxy?" he said when Andre picked up. "I need 2 more days on the drivetrain," Andre said. "You? Good. Listen, I met with a man named Gerald Fitch this morning." A beat. "The collector? Fitch from Ann Arbor? You know him?" "I know of him," Andre said. "He's been in the Detroit car community since before either of us was born. Serious guy." "He's bringing his cars to us," Mason said. 4 of them. First one comes in next month." Andre was quiet for a moment. "What kind of cars?" He didn't say specifically. He said significant ones. Another pause. "Mason. Yeah, we're going to need more space." Mason looked at the street around him, at the buildings, at the block, at the neighborhood he'd been walking for 8 months and reading the way you read a thing you're starting to understand. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." The Galaxy finished in late September. It was not the most dramatic car they'd done. A 1965 Ford Galaxy 500 in Rangoon red. A full-size car with a 390 cubic inch engine that was handsome in the understated way of 60s American full-size cars before everything got wide and low and aggressive. It sold at a private sale for $61,000, which was less than any of the others but which reflected the car's position in the collector hierarchy accurately and which Mason had expected. What he hadn't expected was who bought it. The buyer was a woman named Dolores Vance, who was 73 years old and had driven 2 hours from Flint in a car that was at least 15 years old to look at a vehicle she'd been searching for since 1998. She told Mason this while she was walking around the Galaxy, and she told it without any particular emotion, just as context. "My father had one," she said. "Same color. I rode in it my whole childhood." She looked at the car. "I don't have what people who buy these cars have, but I've been saving for a long time." Mason looked at her. Then he looked at the car. Then he said, "What are you comfortable with?" She told him a number that was below his asking price. He looked at the Galaxy for a long moment. "Okay," he said. Andre, who had overheard this from across the shop and who said nothing about it until after Dolores Vance drove away, carefully, slowly, like someone transporting something precious, came to stand beside Mason in the parking lot while they watched her go. "You took a loss on that," Andre said. "No, I didn't," Mason said. "I sold it for what it was worth to the right person." Andre looked at him sideways. "That's the kind of thing that sounds good, but doesn't pay the electric bill." "I know," Mason said. "I'm not going to do it every time, but that woman drove 2 hours from Flint, and she's been looking for that car for 25 years. He shrugged. "Some things shouldn't only go to the people with the most money." Andre was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know the problem with you." "What?" "You make it hard to argue with you." He turned and went back inside. "I'm going to start pulling the Pantera's cover. unless you want to be here for it. Mason looked at the empty street where Dolores Vance's taillights had been. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. He stood there in this parking lot for the 5 minutes he'd asked for, in the late September air that was starting to carry the first edge of fall in it, the sun going lower earlier now, the neighborhood shifting toward the quieter register of autumn. He thought about the galaxy and Dolores Vance, and 25 years of looking for something you remembered. He thought about how the same car could mean completely different things to different people, and how the money was real but wasn't the whole story and never had been. Then he went inside. Andre had the tarp half off the Pantera. The oxidized red caught the shop lights in a way it hadn't before. Now that the lights were better, and the space was cleaner, and there was more of everything than there had been in February. Mason grabbed the other side of the tarp, and they pulled it the rest of the way together and stood in front of the car. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Damaged wing, missing mirror, dust in the body seams. 11,412 miles on the odometer. But the shop was different around it. The shop was a different place than it had been when Mason first stood in front of this car with a flashlight and a notebook and nothing else. And that changed what the car looked like somehow, the way context always changes what you're looking at. "Okay," Mason said. "Okay," Andre said. They stood there for another moment, both looking at the car. "This is going to be the hardest thing we've done," Andre said. "I know. And the best." Mason looked at the Pantera, at the lines of it, even under all the damage and the years, the specific beauty that Italian designers in 1971 had put into the proportions of this car, the way it sat low and wide and deliberately like something that knew exactly what it was. "Yeah," he said, "it's going to be the best." He reached out and put his hand on the roof of the car, the same way he'd put his hand on the Mustang's hood that first morning, feeling the cold metal under his palm. This time the feeling was different. Not the tentative contact of a man who wasn't sure yet, but the touch of someone claiming something, taking hold of the next hard, necessary thing. He let go, picked up his notebook, turned to a fresh page, and wrote the date at the top. The Pantera disassembly began on the first Monday of October, and it was immediately clear that the car had been keeping secrets. Not bad secrets exactly, just the kind of secrets that old machines keep. Layered histories, previous decisions made by previous hands, evidence of a life lived before the long silence of the tarp. Mason and Andre spent the first 3 days doing nothing but documentation, photographing every component before it was touched, recording every measurement, mapping the car's condition in the kind of systematic detail that would matter later when the reassembly began, and memory alone was not sufficient. Andre pulled the engine on day 4. The 351 Cleveland came out of the mid-engine bay with the specific reluctance of something that had been in one place for 30 years, and when Andre finally got it onto the engine stand and they could see it properly under the shop lights, both of them were quiet for a moment. "It's cleaner than it should be," Andre said. "Somebody took care of it," Mason said. Before the 30 years of nothing, yeah." Andre crouched and looked at the block from below. This engine was maintained by someone who knew what they were doing, up until some time. Then it just stopped. He looked at Mason. "You ever find out the history of the building?" "Some of it," Mason said. Patricia found records going back to 1974. The building was a private garage, not a commercial shop, a private collection, owned by a man named Voss, Frank Voss. He apparently had money, and he apparently had cars. And then in 1987, he died intestate, and the estate got tied up in probate for years. The building changed hands twice after that through the estate settlement, neither time to anyone who knew what was in it or cared. He paused. The last entity that owned it before the Vaughn Company was a holding company out of Ohio that bought distressed properties and sat on them. Andre looked at the engine. "So Voss drove this car." "Voss drove this car," Mason said. 11,000 miles, and then it stopped. Andre was quiet for another moment. "That's sad," he said, which was not the kind of thing Andre usually said, and which Mason noted without commenting on. They worked on the Pantera the way you work on something you know is important, carefully, but not gingerly. There was a distinction Mason had developed over years of this work between care and timidity, between respect for a machine and the kind of excessive caution that was really just fear of making a decision. The Pantera deserved the former, not the latter. Frank Voss, whoever he had been, had loved this car enough to maintain it properly, had driven it only 11,000 miles, had, presumably, covered it and left it in a building that he either believed someone would return to or had simply stopped being able to think about. The least Mason could do was approach the restoration with the same seriousness the car had been given in its first life. The cooling system was everything Andre had predicted. The original radiator was beyond saving. Andre had a word for it that Mason had heard him use exactly once before, and the word was catastrophic, and he used it quietly, almost respectfully, the way you'd describe a natural disaster. The water pump had seized. The hoses had dried and cracked to something that was more archaeology than automotive. They sourced a period-correct replacement radiator through Gerald Fitch, who had a contact at a supplier in New Jersey who specialized in Italian car cooling components, and who called Mason personally when the part was confirmed available. "It's the right one?" Mason said. "It's the right one," Fitch said. "I had my man verify the part number against the factory spec. You'll need to have it record, but the tank dimensions are correct." "How did you find it that fast?" "I've been in this business for 40 years, Fitch said. "I have a list of phone numbers that would surprise you." Mason believed him. Gerald Fitch's first car came into the shop the third week of October, a 1966 Ferrari 275 GTB that arrived on a closed-enclosed trailer with a driver who didn't speak and a handwritten note from Fitch that said simply, "Be careful with it. It knows if you're not." Andre looked at the note and then at Mason. "Does he mean the car, or does he mean him?" "Both, probably," Mason said. The Ferrari changed the atmosphere of the shop in a way Mason hadn't anticipated. It wasn't about the money, though the money was significant. Fitch's cars were in a different price tier than anything Mason had worked on before. It was something else, something harder to articulate. The Ferrari was a European car, a different philosophy of engineering, a different set of principles about what a car was supposed to be and how it was supposed to accomplish it. Working on it required Mason to reach into parts of his knowledge that he hadn't used in a while, to think differently about the problems, to be more deliberate in ways that were uncomfortable in a useful way. He found himself enjoying it in the specific, slightly pained way that you enjoy things that are difficult. Andre adapted faster than Mason had expected. Andre, whose background was purely American muscle, took to the Ferrari's engine with a curiosity that Mason recognized as the best thing a mechanic could bring to unfamiliar work. He asked questions. He read the factory manual, which Fitch had provided along with the car, with the same attention he brought to everything. He got something wrong on the second day and caught it before it became a problem, and told Mason immediately and without embarrassment, which was the kind of thing Mason had come to depend on from him without quite acknowledging it. The days shortened. October became November. The auction where Mason planned to present the Pantera was scheduled for the third weekend in November, which gave him 7 weeks from the start of October. It was tight, tighter than he'd wanted, but the timeline was what the timeline was. And Mason had learned over the course of this year that tight timelines clarified things. You stopped deliberating about peripheral decisions. You stopped reorganizing the priorities. You just worked. Andre was on the Pantera's drivetrain. Mason was doing bodywork. Tyler came 4 days a week now instead of weekends, working on the expansion of the shop into the adjacent space, the Fenwick Street warehouse that Patricia Cho had negotiated down to a price that Mason had paid in cash, which was the most money he had ever spent in a single transaction, and which had required him to sit in Patricia's office for a full minute after signing before he trusted his legs enough to stand up. "You okay?" Patricia had said. "Yeah," he said, "just letting it settle." "That's a normal response," she said. "Is it?" "For someone who was repairing cars for spare money 8 months ago, paying cash for a commercial property." "Yes," she said. "That's a completely normal response." He'd driven past the Fenwick property on the way home that night, the way he'd driven past the garage on Vernor the night he'd first looked at it. It was a larger building, 8,000 square feet to the garage's 5, with a loading dock and a section in the rear that could be converted to a paint facility. Tyler had been over it twice and had a plan for the renovation that was aggressive but executable. By spring, if everything went to schedule, they'd have a facility that could handle 6 cars simultaneously and that had the infrastructure to do the kind of work that serious collectors expected from serious shops. He hadn't told anyone he was thinking about a name for the company. It had been Reed Restoration on the website Tyler had built, a placeholder, a functional description. But a real company needed a name that meant something, and Mason had been turning it over in his mind for weeks without landing on it. He'd written down options in the back of the notebook, pages of them, crossed out, reconsidered, crossed out again. Nothing had felt right yet, and he decided not to force it. Names either came or they didn't, and forcing a name was like forcing a restoration. The result looked finished, but wasn't. Lily came to the shop on a Saturday in early November when the Pantera was deep into the bodywork stage. Mason had been working on the rear quarter panels, which required the most painstaking attention of any body section on the car. The De Tomaso's distinctive rear haunches were the most visible part of the car's identity, the element that made it look like what it was, and any imperfection in the bodywork there would be immediately visible to anyone who knew the car. Lily sat in her chair and watched him work for a long time without speaking. She'd gotten better at this over the months, at sitting in the shop without needing to be entertained, without filling the silence, just being in the space the way a person could be in a space if they were comfortable in it. She brought a book most days, but today the book was in her bag and she was just watching. "It's different now," she said finally. Mason kept working. "Oh, what is?"
"The shop. It feels different than when we started." He looked up. She was looking around the space, at the Ferrari in the third bay, at the expanded tool setup along the wall, at the new lighting Tyler had installed, at the Pantera in the center of everything. "Different how?" he said. She thought about it. "Before it felt like you were trying something," she said. "Now it feels like something." She paused. "I don't know if that makes sense." "It makes sense," he said.
She looked at the Pantera. "Is this the most important car?" "Yes." "Because of the money?" He thought about the honest answer. "Because of what it means if we do it right," he said. "The money is part of it, but not all of it." Lily considered this. "What's the rest of it?" Mason set down the tool he was holding. He looked at the Pantera, at the work he'd done over the past 5 weeks, the panels coming back to true, the body lines re-emerging from under the years of neglect, the car becoming again what it had been before Frank Voss died, and the building went dark and everyone stopped looking. "Some things matter because they're rare," he said. "Not just financially rare, rare like there aren't many of them, and the ones that exist need to be taken care of, because once they're gone, they're gone. This car is one of those things." He paused. "Doing it right matters beyond what I'm going to get paid for it." Lily looked at him. "Okay," she said, in the way she said okay when she was storing something away rather than just agreeing with it. Then she picked up her book and started reading. The Pantera's paint was the decision that kept Mason awake longest. The original color, Italian racing red, Rosso Corsa, the specific shade that De Tomaso had used in 1971, was a color with a history and a specification and an emotional weight for collectors of this car. Matching it exactly required sourcing a period-correct formula and working with a painter who understood the difference between modern approximations and the real thing. Mason had 2 conversations with the painter he'd been using, a meticulous man named Harold, who operated out of a shop in Dearborn, and who had done the Mustang and the Charger's finish work, and Harold had told him straight that the red was going to be difficult. "How difficult?" Mason said. "The original formula used materials that aren't made anymore," Harold said. "I can get close. I can get very close, but I can't promise exact." "How close is very close?" "Side by side with a reference sample, a trained eye would see a difference," Harold said. "In the room with the car by itself, at a collector auction, nobody who isn't specifically looking for it is going to see it." Mason thought about this. "Gerald Fitch would see it," he said. "Gerald Fitch would probably see it," Harold agreed, "and the serious buyers would have Gerald Fitch look at it, or someone like him." Harold was quiet for a moment. "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking you how we get to exact," Mason said. Harold looked at him for a long moment. "It's going to cost more," he said. "I'd need to source a specific pigment. There's a man in Cleveland who synthesizes historical automotive pigments. I've used him once before. It takes 2 weeks and it's not cheap." "Do it," Mason said. Harold started to say something about the cost and Mason stopped him. "I know what it costs," Mason said. "I've been thinking about this paint for 2 months. Do it." Harold called the man in Cleveland that afternoon. The first week of November brought 2 things simultaneously. The Pantera's paint arrived from Harold's shop. The red that was, if not exactly exact, as close to exact as anyone living could reasonably achieve, and which made Mason stand in front of the car for a long time the first afternoon it was in the light. And a magazine arrived in the mail, not a trade publication, not Great Lakes Quarterly, a national business magazine, the kind that sat in airport lounges and dentist offices and the waiting rooms of companies that wanted to project a certain image. It was open on the workbench when Mason came in that morning, left there by Andre, who had arrived first, and who was at his station doing something with the Ferrari's brake system, and who said, without looking up, "Page 47. Mason picked up the magazine and turned to page 47. It was a 2-page spread about Scarlett Vaughn. Detroit's most ambitious developer bets on the next neighborhood. There was a photograph of her on a construction site, helmet on, arms crossed, looking at something off camera with the expression of someone who was already thinking about what came after. She was 30, and she looked it and also didn't. The kind of person who had been operating at a pace that compresses experience, so that at 30 she carried things most people didn't accumulate until much later. The article was about her expansion into what it called transitional neighborhoods, areas the magazine described as undervalued and overlooked, positioned for growth as the city continued its slow resurrection. It mentioned several specific corridors. One of them was the Vernor Highway area. Mason read that section twice. Then he set the magazine down and looked at the shop around him, at what had been built in the past 9 months, at the Pantera in its bay, at the Ferrari, at the expanded tool setup, at the framed photographs on the wall that Sandra had taken for the magazine piece, the before and afters, the documentation of a year's worth of serious work. At the window where, if you stood at the right angle, you could see down the block to the Fenwick property that now had Mason's name on the deed. He picked up his phone and called Patricia Cho. "I just saw the Vaughn piece in the National magazine," he said. Patricia's voice was even. "I saw it this morning. The Vernor corridor. I know. How does that affect the Fenwick position?" "It doesn't affect your ownership of it," Patricia said. "You own it. That's not going anywhere." A brief pause. "It does mean the market value of the surrounding properties is probably going to move faster than we projected, which is good for you as an owner and complicated for you if you were planning to acquire anything else in the area." "I was planning to acquire one more parcel," Mason said. "The lot behind your garage." "Yes." "I'd move on that," Patricia said with a directness that told him she'd been thinking about it already. "I'd move on it this week." "Make the call," Mason said. He hung up and stood for a moment in the middle of the shop. Andre had stopped working at some point during the phone call and was looking at him with an expression that was asking a question without asking a question. "Scarlett Vaughn is moving into this neighborhood," Mason said. Andre looked at the magazine on the workbench. "I saw." "We're fine," Mason said. "We own what we own, but the landscape is changing." Andre was quiet. "She's the one who sold you the garage," he said. "Yes?" "For $1,000. "Yes." Andre looked at the Pantera, then at the Ferrari, then at the wall of photographs. "Does she know?" he said. "Know what?" "What's in here? What this is?" He gestured at the space around them. "Does she know what she sold you?" Mason picked up his notebook. "Not yet," he said, and went back to work. The Pantera's final assembly took 11 days. 11 days of putting back everything that had been taken apart, of reconnecting systems that had been separated and cleaned and rebuilt, of making thousands of small decisions that were each individually correct and collectively either right or wrong, depending on how they fit together. Mason and Andre worked in a particular silence during those 11 days, the kind of silence that isn't absence of communication, but is a form of it. Two people who knew each other's work well enough to operate without narration. The new cooling system went in on day 3. Andre installed it with the focused attention of someone who understood that this was the system that had been the car's vulnerability, the thing that had to be right above everything else. He pressure tested it twice. Mason stood there while he did it both times. "It's good," Andre said after the second test. "You sure?" Andre looked at him. "If I wasn't sure, I'd say I wasn't sure." "I know," Mason said. "I'm asking anyway." "It's good," Andre said again without irritation. The interior was done by Tyler's cousin, a woman named Rosa who worked leather and fabric,
and who had matched the original tan vinyl of the Pantera's seats with a precision that made Mason run his hand over the material twice and then call Harold in Dearborn just to tell him about it, because Harold had been asking how the interior was coming along. "She matched the vinyl?" Harold said. "Exactly," Mason said. A pause. "How?" "She found a period original sample through a collector in Florida and had it analyzed," Mason said. "She said she wasn't going to do it otherwise." Harold was quiet for a moment. "You surrounded yourself with good people, Mason." "I got lucky," Mason said. "It's not luck that those people are working on your cars," Harold said. "Luck gets you the first one. The rest of it is something else." Mason replaced the missing side mirror with one sourced from a parts car in Germany, a transaction that had taken 6 weeks and involved 2 international wire transfers and a customs form that Tyler had helped him fill out incorrectly once before getting it right. The cracked rear wing he had repaired by a composite specialist in Ann Arbor who had done work for racing teams and who approached the crack with the same seriousness he'd apparently applied to structural components that had gone 200 miles an hour. On the 10th day, Mason drove the Pantera. Just inside the shop, at first, he started the engine and let it run, listened to the 351 Cleveland settle into its idle, which was nothing like the American muscle cars and nothing like the Ferrari, and was precisely itself. Then he opened the roll-up door and moved the car out into the parking lot and sat there with the engine running and the morning light hitting the Rosso Corsa paint, which in direct sunlight was a color that was almost violent in its intensity, the red that Italian sports cars had been painted since before anyone alive could remember, the red that meant something specific to anyone who had ever cared about cars. Andre was standing in the parking lot. Tyler was standing in the parking lot. Gerald Fitch, who had come by that morning without announcing himself, which was apparently something Gerald Fitch did, was standing near the door with his arms crossed. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Andre said, "Take it around the block." "The plates aren't—" "Take it around the block, Mason." He took it around the block. He drove it slowly, not because the car needed to be driven slowly. It didn't. The 351 was running with a clarity and authority that made slow feel wasteful, but because he wanted to feel every second of it. The steering was heavier than modern cars, direct and demanding, requiring the kind of physical engagement that current vehicles had engineered out of the experience. The clutch had weight to it. The gearbox was precise in the Italian way, which was different from the American way, shorter throws, more deliberate action required. He turned back into the parking lot and cut the engine. The silence after was the particular silence that comes after a significant sound has stopped. Not empty, but full of the echo of what was there. Gerald Fitch walked to the car. He went around it once, slowly, the way he did everything. He crouched and looked at the nose, at the side, at the rear haunches. He stood and looked through the driver's window. He came around to the front again and stood there. "Harold matched the paint," he said. "Almost exactly," Mason said. "Almost exactly is good enough." Fitch looked at him. "You did it right." "We did it right," Mason said, with the specific emphasis of someone who needed that to be understood. Fitch looked at Andre, who was leaning against the garage wall, trying very hard to look like he wasn't moved by any of this, and not quite succeeding. "Your man does good engine work," Fitch said. "My man does great engine work," Mason said. Andre looked at the sky. The auction was on a Saturday. It was held at a facility in a suburb north of Detroit, a purpose-built venue that hosted 6 collector auctions a year, and that had, on this particular November Saturday, drawn buyers and sellers from 14 states and 3 countries. Mason had been there once before as an observer, years ago, before the layoff, before everything. He'd stood in the back and watched cars cross the stage and watched the paddles go up and tried to understand the economy of it, the particular logic of what made something worth 100,000 and something else worth $1 million, and what the difference was between those numbers and what it said about the people holding the paddles. He had not, on that earlier visit, imagined standing here as a consignor. The Pantera arrived on a trailer at 8 in the morning. Mason and Andre had followed in Mason's truck, and they stood in the staging area while the car was unloaded and positioned, both of them in dark suits that they'd bought specifically for this, which was a detail that felt slightly absurd and also completely correct. Tyler had come. Gerald Fitch was already there when they arrived, talking to someone near the registration desk. With the ease of a man who had been at these things so many times, the venue felt like a comfortable room.
Karen Walsh was there. She found Mason in the staging area before the doors opened to buyers and said, "The Pantera looks right," and then went to find a seat, which was her entire contribution to the morning and which was exactly enough.
The car was lot 42, which put it roughly in the middle of the afternoon session. Mason sat through the morning lots in the back of the room with Andre and Tyler and tried to pay attention to the other cars and mostly failed because his attention kept returning to a specific point about 3 hours from now when lot 42 would be announced, and everything that had happened since February would be condensed into however many minutes it took for the bidding to run its course.
Andre beside him was watching the proceedings with his arms crossed, and the expression he wore when he was processing a lot of information without showing any of it on his face. Tyler kept checking his phone, which he did when he was nervous, and which Mason didn't mention. During the lunch break, Mason walked out to the staging area and stood next to the Pantera. The car was in a line with other lots, some of them extraordinary. He could see a pre-war Bugatti 2 spots down, a late 60s Ferrari across the aisle, a lineup of American muscle cars in various states of restoration. The Pantera didn't look out of place. It looked like what it was, a significant car presented honestly, with nothing to hide and nothing exaggerated. He put his hand on the roof, same as always. "You ready?" he said. He was not entirely sure he was talking to the car, or to himself, or to Frank Voss, whoever Frank Voss had been, whose 11,000 miles were recorded on this odometer, and whose care had preserved the engine through 30 years of standing still. He wasn't going to examine the question too hard. He went back inside. Lot 42 was called at 2:17 in the afternoon. The Pantera rolled onto the stage and the room went the way rooms go, when something genuinely worth looking at appears in them. Not silent exactly, but a drop in the ambient noise, a collective shift of attention, the particular stillness of people who are deciding how they feel about something. The auctioneer was a professional, in the way that the people who do those jobs at serious events are professional, moving the room, reading the energy, providing just enough information to orient buyers without slowing the momentum. He gave the provenance: original, unrestored, numbers matching, one of a documented small number of unmodified examples in known existence. He mentioned the restoration work, the mechanical overhaul, the cosmetic restoration, the documentation. The opening bid was set. A paddle went up. Mason was standing against the back wall with Andre and Tyler. He was not watching the stage. He was watching the room, watching the paddles, watching the faces, trying to read what was happening in the spaces between the numbers. The bidding moved faster than he'd expected, and then slowed at a number that made Tyler reach over and grip Mason's arm for a second before catching himself. 2 bidders remained. A man in a gray suit near the front who had been calm and deliberate throughout, and a woman on the phone bidder system that the auctioneer was relaying bids from, someone on the other end of a line who wasn't in the room. The gray suit bid. The phone bidder countered. The gray suit bid again. The auctioneer looked toward the phone representative who was speaking quietly into the headset, relaying the counter. A pause. The representative nodded. The phone bidder countered. The gray suit took a moment. Then he set his paddle down on his knee. The auctioneer called the number 3 times. The hammer came down. $178,000. The room gave the particular sound of a room that has just witnessed something it considers significant. Not a roar, not applause exactly. More like a collective exhale followed by the sound of people beginning to talk to each other. Mason stood at the back wall and felt the number land in him the way the 95,000 had landed 9 months ago, except different. The 95,000 had been relief. This was something else. This was the number that said the thing was real. Not just working, not just functional, but actually real. The kind of real that other people could see. Andre was looking at the stage. Tyler was looking at Mason. Gerald Fitch, across the room, caught Mason's eye and nodded once. A small, specific nod that carried more information than a long conversation. 178, Tyler said, quietly, almost to himself. Yeah, Mason said. Mason. I heard it. Andre turned and looked at him. His face was doing several things at once, none of them entirely resolved. That's the number you kept crossing out, he said. That's close to it, Mason said. What was the number you kept crossing out? Mason was quiet for a moment. 175, he said. Andre looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You crossed out the right number." They went through the paperwork afterward, the consignor process, the documentation, the handoff of provenance records and restoration files to the auction house for transfer to the buyer. Mason did it with the focus of someone who understood that the last 5% of any transaction was as important as the first 95. He answered the questions the auction house staff asked him, signed what needed signing, and made sure the binder he'd prepared, 200 pages of documentation, photographs, parts records, the Pantera registry confirmation of the production number, Andre's drivetrain rebuild records, Harold's paint formulation notes, was transferred correctly. When it was done, he walked out of the building and stood in the parking lot in the November air. It was cold. Not February cold, not the sideways from the river cold that had been present on the morning he'd met Scarlett Vaughn on the sidewalk outside a building she was throwing away. Just regular November cold, gray sky, a few cars in the lot, the sound of the highway somewhere nearby. He stood there long enough that Andre came out and stood beside him. "You okay?" Andre said. "Yeah. You look like you're waiting for something." "I don't know what I'm waiting for," Mason said. "Maybe for it to feel finished." "Does it?" Mason thought about it. "No," he said. "But I don't think that's a bad thing." Andre was quiet for a moment. "The Shelby's almost done," he said. This was true. They'd been close to finishing Karen Walsh's car for 2 weeks, the last details being addressed with the same care as the first ones. "And Gerald's Ferrari needs another month, maybe 6 weeks. And the Fenwick build-out," Mason said. "And the Fenwick build-out," Andre agreed. "And whatever comes next." "There's always whatever comes next," Andre said. They stood there for another moment in the cold. Then the door behind them opened and Tyler came out, slightly breathless, the way he got when he had news he wanted to deliver. "You have a phone call," he said to Mason. "Well, a message. Someone at the auction house told someone who told me." He paused. "Scarlett Vaughn is here." Mason turned. "What?" "She was in the room," Tyler said. "She didn't bid, or if she did, it wasn't on the Pantera, but she was here." He looked at Mason steadily. "She wants to talk to you. She left her number with the auction house." Mason stood in the parking lot and looked at the number Tyler had written on a folded piece of paper. He thought about the morning in February, the SUVs, the quick scan of his jacket and his boots and his face. "Enjoy it," said to the cold air. He thought about everything that came after. He folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of the dark suit jacket. "Not today," he said. Tyler looked at him. "No?" "Not today," Mason said again. "Today I'm going home." He paused. "I told Lily I'd make dinner." He drove home through the gray November afternoon, the city moving past the truck windows in its usual indifferent way, the radio on low. He thought about the Pantera and the hammer coming down and Andre saying, "You crossed out the right number." He thought about Frank Voss and 11,000 miles and 30 years under a tarp. He thought about the Fenwick building and Patricia Cho's voice when she said I'd move on that this week, and the particular satisfaction of being someone who moved when the moment required it. He stopped at a grocery store and bought the ingredients for the pasta Lily liked, the one with the slightly complicated sauce that he'd had to look up a video for the first time and had since made enough times to do from memory. He drove the rest of the way home with the grocery bag on the passenger seat, the cold outside and the heat inside, and the city going quiet around him the way it did on weekend afternoons when people were inside and the streets belonged to nobody in particular. Lily was at the kitchen table when he got home, homework spread out, pencil in hand. She looked up when he came in. "How'd it go?" she said. He set the grocery bag on the counter. "Good," he said. She waited. She'd learned over the year how to wait for him, how to give him the space to land before she asked for more. 178, he said. She looked at him. He could see her doing the math, the way she did math, quickly, without drama. Her eyes went wide for a moment, and then she composed herself, which was something she'd been doing more lately, the way kids did when they were growing up and had decided that big reactions were for younger versions of themselves. "That's a lot of hot chocolates," she said. He laughed. It came out exactly the way it had the first time she'd said it, loud and sudden and real. "Yeah," he said. "That's a lot of hot chocolates. Are we going to celebrate?" He was already getting the pasta pot out. "I'm making dinner," he said. That's the celebration. Lily looked at him for a moment. That's kind of a low-key celebration for 178, she said. Some things don't need to be loud, he said. She went back to her homework. He started water boiling on the stove and began chopping vegetables with the knife he'd had for 10 years. The blade worn thin from sharpening, the handle wrapped in tape where the original material had cracked. He should replace it. He kept not replacing it. The kitchen smelled like garlic and onion and the particular warmth of a house being lived in. And outside the window, the November sky was going dark in the early way it did this time of year. The streetlights coming on before dinner was finished, the neighborhood settling into evening. He cooked. Lily did her homework. Neither of them said much. It was, Mason thought, exactly right. The number on Scarlett Vaughn's folded paper sat in Mason's jacket pocket for 4 days before he called it. He wasn't avoiding it, exactly. He was letting it be what it was. A piece of information that didn't require immediate action, the way most things that felt urgent weren't actually urgent once you looked at them straight. He'd put the jacket on its hanger when he got home the night of the auction, Lily asleep by then, the house quiet, and he'd seen the folded paper in the inside pocket and left it there. Each morning when he got dressed, he chose a different jacket, not deliberately, just because that was how it worked out. On the 4th day, he wore the dark suit jacket to the shop because Gerald Fitch was coming to check on the Ferrari's progress, and wearing the dark jacket felt appropriate for Gerald Fitch. He found the paper when he reached into the pocket for his phone. He stood in the middle of the shop and held it for a moment, then put his phone away and unfolded it. He called the number. It rang twice. "This is Scarlett Vaughn." "Mason Reed," he said. "You left your number with the auction house." A brief pause, short enough that if he hadn't been paying attention, he'd have missed it, but he was paying attention. "Mr. Reed, thank you for calling." Her voice was professional, measured, the voice of someone who had trained themselves not to show things in the first 20 seconds of a conversation. "I was hoping we could meet. At your convenience." "What about?" Another brief pause. "A few things," she said. "I have some business in the neighborhood where your garage is located, and I was at the auction on Saturday. I saw the Pantera." She stopped. "I'd like to talk to you in person, if that's possible." He looked around the shop, at the Ferrari in the 3rd bay, at the Fenwick building plan spread on the workbench, at the empty space where the Pantera had been for 2 months, and which now felt like a room where a significant piece of furniture had been moved, the outline of its presence still somehow visible. He thought about the morning in February, the quick scan, the keys dropped on the table. Enjoy it. "I can do Thursday," he said. 11 o'clock, at the shop. "I'll be there," she said. He hung up and stood there for another moment. Andre was looking at him from the Ferrari's engine bay. "That who I think it was?" he said. "Yes." Andre went back to what he was doing. "You want me to be here Thursday or not be here?" Mason thought about it. "Be here," he said. "Do your work. I'm not staging anything." Andre made a small sound of acknowledgement and kept working. The Karen Walsh Shelby GT350 was finished that Wednesday. It had been in the shop for 6 months, the longest any single car had stayed, and its completion had a different quality than the others. The Shelby had never been Mason's car to sell. It had always been Karen's, and it had been in the shop as a trust more than a transaction. He'd treated it accordingly, and finishing it felt less like a milestone and more like a return. Giving back something that had been loaned to him, improved but not changed in any essential way. Karen came to pick it up on Wednesday afternoon. She drove a sensible sedan into the parking lot, got out, and walked into the shop without ceremony, the way she did everything. The Shelby was in the 1st bay, facing out, the Wimbledon white catching the winter afternoon light in the clean way of original factory colors. She stopped about 10 feet from it and stood there. Mason had seen this before. Had seen it with the Mustang buyer, had seen it with Dolores Vance and the Galaxy, had seen it with Gerald Fitch looking at the Pantera. The stillness that came over people when they encountered a car that mattered to them. He didn't say anything and didn't move, just let her have the moment. She walked to the car and put her hand on the roof, opened the driver's door and looked inside, closed it, walked around to the front and looked at the engine through the raised hood that Mason had left open. She reached in and touched the Paxton supercharger the way you'd touch something you'd been worried about. "It's all there," Mason said. "I can see that." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that he recognized.
Grief has a sound when it's kept controlled, and Karen Walsh had been keeping it controlled for years. The leather matches, she said. She found a period sample in Florida, had it analyzed. Karen closed the hood carefully. She turned and looked at Mason. My husband bought this car the year before we met, she said. He used to say it was the most honest thing he owned. He meant the car didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. She paused. I think he was talking about himself too. Mason nodded. He didn't fill the silence because it didn't need filling. You kept it honest, she said. That's all I asked. She handed him the final payment, the balance they'd agreed on, which was substantial, and which Karen had never once tried to renegotiate. Not during the plumbing disaster, not during the long months of careful sourcing, not at any point when a less straightforward client might have found a reason to revisit the number. She drove the Shelby out of the bay and down the street and out of sight, moving carefully, at the pace of someone transporting something precious. The same pace Dolores Vance had used with the Galaxy. Mason watched her go. Then he went inside and stood in the empty first bay, which was the most space the shop had had since February. He stayed there for a minute, just standing in the empty space. Then he picked up his notebook and wrote, Shelby done. Bay 1 open. Start Fitch Alpha next week. He had agreed with Gerald Fitch the previous week to take on a 1967 Alfa Romeo Giulia Sprint, the third of Fitch's 4 cars, which would come after the Ferrari was finished. The Ferrari was 3 weeks from completion. The Fenwick build-out was ahead of schedule. Tyler had called Monday to say the main floor was structurally finished and the electrical was 60% done. By spring, the expanded operation would be running, and Mason had begun the hiring process for 2 additional mechanics. That was a sentence he had to read twice in his own notebook before it felt real. Hiring process for 2 additional mechanics. He'd written it and then stared at it and then turned the page because looking at it too long felt like tempting something. Thursday at 11, Scarlett Vaughn arrived exactly on time. She came in a single car this time. No convoy of Escalades, no Priya with the portfolio, no man in a gray peacoat on his phone. Just a black sedan, a driver who stayed in the car, and Scarlett Vaughn herself in a dark coat, walking across the parking lot with the same purposeful stride he remembered from February, though something was different about it that he couldn't immediately name. He was at the workbench when she came through the side door, and he turned and looked at her and let the silence be a second long before he said, Ms. Vaughn. Mr. Reed. She looked around the shop. He watched her do it, watched her take in the Ferrari in the third bay, the expanded tool setup, the Fenwick plans on the workbench, the photographs on the wall, the organized and purposeful evidence of a serious operation. Andre was in the far bay doing something with the Ferrari's fuel system, visible but not looking up. Her eyes moved across all of it, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him. This isn't what I expected, she said. What did you expect? She considered the question honestly, which he hadn't been sure she would do. I'm not sure exactly. Something smaller. She looked at the photographs on the wall. The before and after shots Sandra had taken, the documentation of 9 months of work. Is that the Pantera? She was pointing at one of the photos, the one Sandra had taken of the car early in the restoration. The oxidized red still dull, the damage still visible. Yes, and that's how it looked when you found it. That's how it looked. She looked at the photo for a moment. I saw it at the auction, she said, before it went on stage. I was in the staging area. I knew what it was because I'd read the catalog. She paused. I didn't know it had come from the garage on this block until I talked to someone at the auction house. How did you end up at the auction? He asked. I buy collector cars occasionally, she said. For investment. The November auction is usually worth attending. She turned and looked at him directly. I didn't bid on the Pantera. I thought about it, but I'd already understood by then that I'd done something stupid in February, and bidding on a car that had come from a building I'd sold for $1,000 felt like exactly the wrong move. A small pause. Even if I could have won it, Mason looked at her. What would you have done with it? Put it in storage, she said without hesitation. Which is exactly what Frank Voss did, and we both know how that ended. She said it flatly, without drama, as though she'd been sitting with that specific thought for a while. He pulled out the stool from under the workbench and gestured to it. She looked at it for a moment. It was not the kind of seating that Scarlett Vaughn usually sat on, and they both understood that. And then she sat on it. He leaned against the workbench.
You said you had business in the neighborhood, he said.
I do.
She reached into her coat and produced a folded page, printed, not handwritten, which told him she'd prepared this, thought about it before coming. She unfolded it and held it out. My company has been quietly acquiring properties along the Verner corridor for the past 4 months. We have 12 parcels under contract or in due diligence. She paused. The property on Fenwick Street was on our target list. Mason looked at the page. He recognized the addresses. He'd been studying this same map for 6 months. He found the Fenwick property and saw it listed with a note. Acquired. Private buyer. I know, he said. My attorney closed on that 2 months ago. Scarlett looked at him. It was the first time he'd seen something genuinely unguarded in her expression. Not shock exactly, more like the specific recalibration of someone who has just found out the terrain has changed while they were looking somewhere else. Your attorney. Patricia Cho, he said. She reached out the same week your company started making noise in the area. I moved fast. Scarlett was quiet for a moment. Cho is good, she said. Yes, he said. She is. A silence settled between them. Not hostile, not comfortable exactly, but honest in the way that silences are when both people in them understand the situation clearly. He watched her absorb it. That the man she'd dismissed on a February morning had spent the intervening 9 months not just building a business in the building she'd thrown away, but positioning himself in the real estate surrounding it, quietly, patiently, without announcing himself, the same way he'd approached the garage itself. The lot behind your building, she said. We weren't able to get a clean contact on the owner. I know, Mason said. I closed on that one last week. She looked at him. This time she didn't try to compose her expression immediately, and he saw something move through it. Something complicated, something that a year ago she might have not allowed to be visible. You knew we were coming, she said. I knew someone was coming, he said. Once the transit project was confirmed, this corridor was obvious. It didn't have to be you. He paused. But I read the National magazine piece, and I know how you operate. She set the folded page on the workbench. How do I operate? He thought about how to say it. Not to wound her, not to score anything, just to say it accurately. You're good at identifying value before other people see it, he said. You just don't always look closely enough at what's already there. The shop was quiet. Andre had stopped working in the back bay. Mason could hear the silence from that direction, the deliberate quiet of someone who was listening without pretending not to. Scarlett held his gaze for a moment. Something in her face went through a small, real change. Not a collapse, not a performance of contrition. More like a person who has been carrying an argument they know they've been losing, finally setting it down. I was wrong about you, she said. In February, I looked at you and I saw something I'd seen before. Someone who would fail. I made that judgment in about 30 seconds. She paused. I've made a lot of decisions in 30 seconds in my career, and most of them have been right. That one was wrong. Mason was quiet for a moment. He thought about the response he might have given 6 months ago, the one with some edge to it, the one that would have felt satisfying for about 20 seconds and then hollow. He didn't reach for that. You saw what was there, he said. The jacket, the work boots, the check that was small enough to be embarrassing. He paused. You saw the surface. A lot of people only look at the surface. I've done it too. He looked at the photographs on the wall. The difference is you had the information in front of you, literally, under a tarp in the building you were selling, and didn't bother to look. He looked back at her. That's not a character flaw. That's a habit. Habits can change. She was quiet, and he let the quiet stand. What do you want from this conversation? She said finally. It was a direct question, and he respected it. Nothing from you specifically, he said. I'm not here to extract anything. He paused. You came to me. So what do you want? She looked at the workbench, at the Fenwick plans, at the shop around her. I'm going to develop this corridor whether you own 2 parcels or not, she said. That's just business. But how it gets developed, what the neighborhood looks like afterward, that's a different conversation. She looked at him. There are people here, businesses, people who've been on this block for 20 years. She paused, and he heard something shift in the way she was talking. Less managed, more like someone thinking out loud. I'm not always good at that part. The people part.
No, he said. You're not. She didn't flinch at that. He gave her credit for it. I'd like to do it better on this one, she said. I don't know exactly what that looks like.
Mason looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the taqueria 2 doors down with its sidewalk tables in summer, the barbershop with the music on Saturday mornings, the kid in the hoodie who'd stood at the open door and looked at the GTO with that carefully neutral expression. The block as it was, before anyone with money and plans arrived to decide what it should become.
There's a man named Hector Ruiz who owns the taqueria on this block, Mason said. He's been there 11 years. His lease is month to month and the building is on your list. He paused. Before you make any decisions about that building, you should sit down with Hector, not to negotiate, just to listen. Scarlett looked at him. That's your condition? It's not a condition, he said. It's a suggestion. You said you wanted to do it better. That's where better starts. He paused. With the actual people. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said.
There's also a barber shop, and a woman named Gloria who runs a hair supply store 2 blocks east, who owns her building outright and is not going to sell it, which you should know before you waste time approaching her. He paused. And there are 6 vacant lots between here and the transit corridor that are owned by an estate out of Cincinnati that hasn't been properly approached because nobody's done the title work carefully enough. He watched her. You might want to look at those. She was looking at him with an expression that was hard to categorize, and that he suspected she wasn't accustomed to other people seeing on her face. How do you know about the Cincinnati estate? Because I've been reading this neighborhood for 9 months, he said, same way I read the garage. He paused. If you look carefully enough at anything, you find things other people missed. A long silence. The shop hummed around them, the sound of the building being alive, the faint noise from the street outside, the ordinary sounds of a place where work happened every day. I owe you an apology, Scarlett said. The words came out without the managed delivery she'd been using for most of the conversation. Just direct, slightly uncomfortable, real. Not for the business decision. Selling the garage for $1,000 was a bad business decision, and I've had to sit with that. But the way I dismissed you in February in front of my staff, that was something else. That wasn't a miscalculation. That was disrespect. Mason looked at her. He let the words land and stay. Yes, he said. It was. She held his gaze. I'm sorry for that. He didn't rush to dissolve it, didn't say it's fine or forget it or any of the things you said to make someone comfortable after they'd admitted something true. He let it be what it was, an acknowledgement given and received between 2 people who both understood what had happened and what it had cost. Okay, he said finally. She stood up from the stool. The Cincinnati estate properties, she said back to her professional register, but not entirely. There was something slightly different about it now, something that had been adjusted. Would you be willing to share what you found on the title research? I'll have Patricia send you what's in the public record, he said. Anything beyond that, we'd have a different conversation. She nodded. She picked up her folded page from the workbench. She looked around the shop one more time, a longer look than the first one, a look that was actually looking rather than cataloging. Her eyes stopped on the empty first bay, the bay where the Shelby had been, where the Mustang had been before that. The bay at the front of the shop where everything had started. The Mustang, she said. The one that started this. I heard about it after the Great Lakes Quarterly piece. Someone in my network mentioned it. Karen Walsh bought it, he said. $95,000. Yes. She looked at the empty bay for a moment. I walked past this building every time I came to this block, she said. For 2 years before we acquired it. I walked right past it. She paused. I never once thought about what was inside it. Most people don't, Mason said. That's how things stay hidden. She put the folded page in her coat pocket and buttoned it. I'll call Hector Ruiz, she said. Good, he said. She walked out. He heard the sedan door close, heard the car pull out of the parking lot. He stood at the workbench for a moment, looking at the empty bay, at the Fenwick plans, at the shop around him. From the back, Andre's voice. She apologized. Yes. You believe her? Mason thought about it honestly. I believe she meant it today, he said. Whether she remembers it when the money gets big enough is a different question. Fair, Andre said, and went back to work. December came in gray and cold, the way December in Detroit always did. The days short and the light low, and the city pulling inward the way northern cities did in winter. The Fenwick build-out finished its structural phase, and Tyler started on the paint booth installation, which was the thing Mason had wanted most. A real spray booth, climate-controlled, with proper ventilation and lighting, the kind of environment where serious finish work could happen without the compromises he'd been making in the main shop since February. Mason stood in the Fenwick building one afternoon and looked at the space. 8,000 square feet, empty and echoing, smelling of fresh drywall and sawdust and the particular cold of a building being transformed. He could see what it was going to be. He'd gotten good at that over the year, better than he'd been, at looking at something in process and seeing what it was moving toward rather than only what it currently was. He took out his notebook and stood in the middle of the empty floor and wrote for a few minutes. He wrote about the space and what would go where, and the timeline for the 2 mechanics he'd hired, who were starting in January. He wrote a note about the Alfa Romeo that was coming in from Fitch after the new year. He wrote a note about a 1969 Corvette L88 that Gerald Fitch had mentioned knowing the location of, an unverified lead that might be nothing or might be the next significant project. Then he turned to the back of the notebook, to the pages where he'd been writing names, the company name. He'd been at it for months, the way you're at something that won't resolve, lists of options, crossed out, reconsidered, crossed out again. Nothing had fit. He told himself it would come when it came and tried to be patient about it, but the Fenwick building was almost ready, and Reed Restoration on a website was not the same thing as a name on a real building, and he needed to decide. He stood in the empty Fenwick space and looked at the pages of crossed-out options. Then he closed the notebook and looked at the room. He thought about what this place was, stripped of all the things it was also going to be. The business, the money, the reputation, the position in a neighborhood that was changing, underneath all of that, what it actually was. It was a place where things that had been given up on came back, where things that had been left in the dark, under tarps, forgotten by the people who should have been paying attention, where those things got seen, got taken apart and understood and put back together as what they were supposed to be. He thought about what Lily had said, that first week, sitting on her chair in the garage while he worked on the Mustang. You've been sad for a long time. At least this way you'd have something to do. He thought about what Karen Walsh had said about her husband's Shelby, the most honest thing he owned. It didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. He thought about Andre saying you crossed out the right number, and Tyler fixing the roof in 20-degree weather without taking a check, and Gerald Fitch sitting across a diner table saying, trust the car. He thought about Frank Voss and 11,000 miles, and Dolores Vance driving 2 hours from Flint, and the kid in the hoodie who'd stood at the open door and looked at the GTO with his hands in his pockets, trying very hard not to look like he cared. He opened the notebook and wrote 2 words, found things. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he wrote it again, more deliberately, as if writing it twice made it more real. Found things restoration. He said it out loud in the empty building just to hear how it sounded. His voice came back off the bare walls and the concrete floor and the high ceiling, slightly different from how he'd said it. A little larger, a little more certain, the way things sounded in empty rooms that were about to be filled. He closed the notebook. The sign went up the second week of January. Tyler made it, which was not something Mason had asked for, but which Tyler had decided to do anyway, showing up one morning with materials and a drill and a level, and spending 3 hours on a ladder getting it exactly right while Mason worked inside and pretended not to watch. The sign was clean and simple, dark metal letters on a light background, mounted above the roll-up door of the Vernor garage, visible from the street in a way that the building, which had been invisible for years, was suddenly not. Found things restoration. Below it, smaller, classic automotive, established 2024. Andre came out of the shop and stood in the parking lot, looking up at it. Found things, he said. Yeah, Mason said. I like it, Andre said. He went back inside. Lily saw it on a Saturday when Mason picked her up and drove her to the shop before they went to get hot chocolate. She got out of the truck and stood in the parking lot and looked at it for a long moment. That's the name? She said. That's the name. She thought about it. It makes sense, she said, because that's what you do. You find things. Sort of, he said. Things that were already there. People just stopped looking. She considered this. That's even better, she said. that they were always there. She looked at the sign one more time, then at him. "Can we get hot chocolate now?" "Yes," he said. "We can get hot chocolate now." They walked down Billionaire to the coffee shop 2 blocks away, the one with the windows that fogged up in winter and the hot chocolate that was slightly too sweet and exactly right. Lily ordered hers with extra marshmallows, same as always. Mason got his plain, same as always. They sat at the table by the window and watched the street through the foggy glass. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah." "Are you still sad?" He looked at her dark brown eyes, the ones that didn't miss things, the ones that had been watching him for a year now, with a patience that children weren't supposed to have, but that she had anyway. This particular child, his daughter, who handed him wrenches the right way and drew pictures of garages and said, "I think it'll be beautiful when you're done." He thought about the honest answer. "Sometimes," he said, "not the same way." He paused. "It's more like, I carry it differently now. It's still there, but it doesn't run everything." She nodded, looking at her hot chocolate. "That sounds better," she said. "It is better," he said. She looked up. What changed? He thought about it. He thought about February, and the $1,000 check, and the keys on a rusted ring, and the flashlight, and the tarps, and everything that had been under them. He thought about what it meant to look at something everyone had walked past and decided to stop and actually see it. "I started paying attention," he said, "to things that were already there." She looked at him for a moment with that look she sometimes got, the old soul look, the look that made him wonder sometimes where she'd come from, this small person who had arrived in his life and decided to love him with a steadiness he hadn't always deserved. "You were always good at that," she said. "You just forgot for a while." He drank his hot chocolate. Outside, Billionaire Highway moved through its December morning. The taqueria with its sign lit against the gray sky. The barber shop with its music audible even from here. The people walking with their collars up and their hands in their pockets. Everyone going somewhere. Everyone carrying something. The neighborhood doing what neighborhoods did. Persisting, changing slowly. Keeping in its bones the history of every person who had walked its streets and every building that had stood on its blocks. The visible and the invisible. The found and the still waiting to be found. And 2 blocks east, above the roll-up door of a building that had been invisible for 30 years, a sign. Found Things Restoration. The city moved around it the way it moved around everything. Indifferent on the surface, paying attention underneath, the way cities always were, the way people always were when you bothered to look. In the spring, when the Fenwick building opened and the transit project broke ground 3 blocks north, and the neighborhood began the slow, complicated process of becoming something new, Mason would look back on the year and find that the thing he remembered most wasn't the Pantera at the auction or the number on the hammer or the moment he'd signed his name on the deed to the Fenwick property. What he remembered was smaller than all of that. A flashlight in a dark building, the first tarp coming off, his hand on the cold hood of a car that had been forgotten so long it had almost become part of the floor, and the feeling, not triumph, not vindication, just something quieter and more durable than either of those, of having looked at something everyone else had walked away from and decided it was worth seeing. That was the thing. That had always been the thing. Not the money. Though the money was real, and it mattered, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. Not the reputation, though the reputation was being built and would keep being built, car by car, decision by decision, in the particular slow way that real things got built. It was just this. That value did not announce itself. It did not come with a sign or a price tag or a guarantee. It sat in dark buildings under old tarps, waiting for someone with the patience to pull the canvas back. It lived in people who wore work jackets and work boots and checked their bank accounts twice before writing small checks. It existed in things that looked like problems until someone with the right eyes looked at them long enough to see through the damage to what was actually there. Mason had known this his whole life. He just needed a building and a set of rusted keys and a February morning cold enough to keep sensible people inside to remember it. He left $1 on the table for the tip. Lily always reminded him if he forgot, which he sometimes did. And they walked back down Billionaire in the winter air, the two of them, father and daughter, the street cold and gray and exactly where they were supposed to be. He unlocked the shop. The lights came on. The day began.